Close your eyes and let your breath settle into something slower than the one you walked in with. Tonight we are going to measure a very small distance and a very large stretch of time. Between the smoking ruins of Troy and a rocky little island called Ithaca lies about 560 miles of open sea, nothing more. A capable ship of the Bronze Age, running with the wind and a little luck, could close that gap in 2 weeks. 3, if the gods were feeling unkind. One man needed 10 years. Before we drift into who he was, hold this thought gently in your hands. Along that impossibly long road, he would be held prisoner by a one-eyed giant, offered a goddess's bed and a life that never ended, and still say no. He would sail his ship into the hush of the underworld itself and speak with the dead. And when at last the sea let him go, he would come home only to find more than 100 strangers camped in his own hall, feasting on his cattle, drinking his wine, and courting his wife as though he were already a ghost. What followed was not gentle. But that ending is a long way off yet, and we have all night to get there slowly. Picture first the island itself, somewhere around the year 1200 before our era. Ithaca is not a wealthy place. Its soil is thin and stony, better suited to goats than to grain, though its harbours run deep and sheltered, the kind a seafaring people learn to love. On the high ground above the water sits a palace, though you should not picture marble or gold. Think instead of a long, low house of timber and quarried stone, storerooms heavy with oil and wine, a great hall built around a central hearth, a courtyard where dogs sleep in warm patches of sun. This house belongs, at least on paper, to a king named Odysseus. He has not set foot inside it in 20 years. He left when his son Telemachus was still a newborn, taking 12 ships and some 600 men east to a war at a city called Troy. A war that lasted a full decade and ended, eventually, in Greek victory. And then, one by one, the kings sailed home. Nestor returned to sandy Pylos to grow old spinning stories of the fighting. Menelaus made it back to Sparta with Helen beside him, the very face that had started the whole ruinous affair. Even Agamemnon, the high king of the Greeks, walked through his own front door again, though what waited for him there is a darker tale for another night. Of Odysseus, though, nothing came home at all. No ship, no message, not even a body to bury. For 10 full years past the war's end, the sea had simply refused either to return him or to confirm that he was gone. And here is where a household begins to come apart. In the Greek world of that age, a throne without a king sitting on it is an open wound, one with no orderly law of succession to close it, no council waiting patiently in the wings. There is only property, and the ambitious men circling it. By the time our story truly opens, 108 of those men have installed themselves inside Odysseus's own hall, sons of the leading families from Ithaca and the islands around it. History remembers them as the suitors, because each one wants Penelope, the queen, and whichever man wins her wins the palace, the herds, and very likely the crown that goes with them. So they wait, and while they wait, they feast. Cattle and pigs are slaughtered day after day, the wine cellars steadily drained, the great hall filled with their noise and their games. No single meal breaks any rule of hospitality, yet 1,000 meals together are quietly bleeding the estate white. The Greeks held a sacred custom called xenia, guest friendship, a duty to shelter and feed the traveller at your door. The suitors have taken this graceful old law and turned it into a kind of slow, smiling theft. They are guests who will never leave. 2 people alone hold the line against them. The first is Penelope, one of the most quietly formidable figures in all of ancient story. She cannot fight the suitors off, and she cannot order them away. What she has instead is patience, and a mind sharper than any of theirs. For 3 years she kept them at bay with a single piece of craft, promising to choose a husband the moment she finished weaving a burial shroud for her aging father-in-law, Laertes. Each day she sat at the loom in plain view. Each night, by torchlight, she unpicked what she had woven, thread by careful thread, so the shroud never grew and the wedding never arrived. It took 3 years and a servant's betrayal before the suitors finally understood the trick. The second is Telemachus, the son, a baby when his father sailed, and now a young man of about 20, who has never once looked upon his father's face. He has grown up mocked in his own house, standing in the shadow of a legend he cannot even remember, old enough now to feel the injustice of it, and not yet strong enough to do a single thing about it. 108 men against one grieving family. This is the shape of Ithaca as our story begins. Notice too that the poem carrying this tale, the Odyssey, does not open with its hero at all. It opens with the wreckage he left behind him. Scholars still argue, gently, over just how much of this island geography reflects a real Bronze Age Ithaca, and how much is poetic memory reshaped by centuries of retelling, since the physical island, known by that name today, does not perfectly match every detail the old poem gives us. What no one disputes is the feeling the ancient audience would have caught instantly, hearing this sung aloud at some evening gathering. This was never simply a tale of monsters and wonders waiting somewhere out at sea. It was a story about a home balanced on the edge of ruin, and about whether anything broken that badly can ever truly be set right again. A word now on where this story actually comes from, because the telling of it is nearly as strange as the tale itself. The poem is credited to a poet named Homer, composed somewhere around the 8th century before our era, some 700 years before Julius Caesar, and nearly 2,700 years before the two of us tonight. And yet the events it describes, the war at Troy and everything after, belong to a still older world, the Greek Bronze Age, 4 or 5 centuries before Homer himself drew breath. That older world had already fallen by the time the poet was born. Its palaces had burned to ash, its writing had been forgotten, its kings had slipped quietly into legend. Homer was singing of a vanished civilization, the way we might tell stories tonight of knights and stone keeps long since crumbled to nothing. For centuries, this poem was never written down at all. It lived instead inside the memories of professional singers, men who could carry tens of thousands of lines in their heads, reshaping and polishing the telling with every performance. Run the whole poem start to finish, and you get roughly 12,000 lines, something like 20 hours of singing, which means its earliest listeners experienced it much as you are experiencing it now, across many quiet evenings, carried by a single voice in the dark. Nobody today can say with certainty who Homer truly was, whether he was one poet or a chorus of many voices folded into a single name, whether, as a stubborn old tradition insists, he was blind. Even the ancient Greeks argued about it among themselves, and 7 separate cities each claimed the honor of being his birthplace, which tells you mainly that claiming Homer was excellent for tourism even 2,500 years ago. What matters most for us tonight, though, is simply the story itself. And the story now needs to find its missing king. Far from Ithaca, at the very hour the suitors are carving up yet another of his oxen, Odysseus is sitting on a beach at what feels like the edge of the world. The island is called Ogygia, and it belongs to a goddess named Calypso, who pulled him half-drowned from a shipwreck 7 years earlier and has kept him ever since. She loves him, in her own fashion, and has offered him something almost no mortal is ever offered: immortality itself, if only he will stay and be her husband forever. He has refused her. Every day he sits on that same shore, looking east across empty water, toward a home he has not laid eyes on in 20 years, and he weeps. He does not know whether his wife has remarried. He does not know his own son's grown face. He does not know that his mother died of grief, or that his elderly father has withdrawn to a hillside farm and now sleeps among the ashes like the lowest of servants. All he knows is that everything he wants sits on the far side of a sea that one very powerful god has sealed against him, and how he came to anger that god, how he lost every one of his 12 ships and all 600 of his men, and how a war fought over one woman first pulled him away from another, is a story that begins much earlier still. It begins in Troy, and Troy begins with a wedding problem, roughly a decade before the fighting, in the city of Sparta. Sparta's king in those days was a man named Tyndareus, whose daughter Helen was said to be the most beautiful woman alive. This should have been a simple blessing. Instead, it became something closer to a security crisis. Every unmarried king and prince across Greece wanted her hand, and dozens arrived in Sparta at once, proud, armed, and thin-skinned about their honor. Whichever man Tyndareus finally chose, all the others stood ready to feel insulted enough to start a war on the spot. The wedding of the age was one careless word away from becoming a battlefield. Among that crowd of suitors stood a young king from the Western Islands, not especially wealthy, not especially striking to look at, but already known for the sharpness of his mind. This was Odysseus. And Odysseus, taking one look at the situation, understood two things at once. First, he stood no real chance of winning Helen against richer, grander rivals. Second, there was still an opportunity worth having here. He went quietly to Tyndareus and offered a way out of the entire dangerous mess in exchange for a single favor. His solution was this. Before any choice was ever announced, every suitor would swear a binding oath before the gods to accept whichever man was chosen, and more than that, to come to that marriage's defense if anyone ever tried to break it apart. Each man, hoping he himself would win, swore freely. Tyndareus then chose Menelaus, a prince of the powerful house of Atreus, and no one could object, because everyone had already promised not to. The favor Odysseus asked in return tells you exactly what he valued. He wanted help winning a different woman entirely, Tyndareus's niece, a steady, clever young woman named Penelope. He got her, and by every account it became that rarest thing in Greek legend, a genuinely happy marriage. Odysseus carried his bride home to Ithaca, and in time they had their son. Notice, though, what he had just done, without quite realizing it. He had diffused a crisis, won himself a powerful friend, and married exactly the woman he wanted. But he had also built, with his own clever hands, the very trap that would one day close on his own life. That oath was a loaded weapon left lying on the table of Greek politics, waiting only for someone reckless enough to pick it up. That someone was a young prince of Troy named Paris. Troy itself was no invention. Its ruins still stand today on a low hill in northwestern Turkey called Hisarlik, overlooking the strait that links the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea. And archaeologists have since dug its massive, sloping stone walls directly out of the earth. To the Greeks of that era, it was a rich, sophisticated, faintly foreign kingdom perched at the edge of their known world. According to the old story, the trouble began at a wedding held on Mount Olympus itself, when the goddess of discord flung a single golden apple, inscribed with the words for the fairest, into a gathering of goddesses. 3 goddesses stepped forward to claim that apple. Hera, queen of the gods, Athena, goddess of war and wisdom, and Aphrodite, goddess of love. Zeus, wise enough to know a trap when he saw one, refused to choose between them himself, and passed the decision instead to a mortal, a handsome young Trojan prince named Paris, who happened, at that moment, to be minding cattle on a quiet mountainside. Each goddess came to him with a bribe. Hera promised dominion over all of Asia. Athena promised wisdom and victory in every battle he would ever fight. Aphrodite promised him simply the most beautiful woman alive. Paris, being young, chose the woman, a decision still considered, by fairly wide agreement, the worst ever made in Greek myth, and that is against very stiff competition. The trouble, of course, was that the most beautiful woman alive already had a husband. This did not slow Aphrodite down in the least. When Paris arrived in Sparta on what looked like an ordinary diplomatic visit, Menelaus welcomed him warmly, feasted him at his own table, and then sailed off, trusting, to attend a funeral in Crete, leaving his royal guest alone in the house with his wife. By the time Menelaus returned, Helen was gone, carried off to Troy alongside a generous portion of the palace's own treasury. Whether she went willingly or was taken against her will is a question the Greeks themselves never settled, and the old sources genuinely disagree, offering both versions without apology. Either way, the old oath came due. Menelaus turned to his brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, and the single most powerful ruler in Greece. And Agamemnon sent the call out across the whole of the Greek world. Every man who had sworn that oath years earlier was now bound by it, obliged to sail for Troy and bring Helen home. And here we meet one of the most quietly human moments in the entire legend. Odysseus did not want to go. He was no coward, but he could count. Troy lay far away. Its walls were already famous, and the coming war promised to be long. He had a young wife, an infant son, and a kingdom that badly needed him at home. An old prophecy had warned him, or so the story goes, that if he sailed for Troy, he would not return for 20 years, and would come home at last alone and unrecognized. So, when the recruiters landed on Ithaca, a sharp noble named Palamedes among them, Odysseus reached for the only escape left to a man bound by a sacred vow. He pretended to be mad. The recruiters found the king of Ithaca out ploughing his own field, and ploughing it wrong in every possible way a field can be ploughed. He had yoked an ox and a donkey together, mismatched animals of entirely different sizes and speeds, so the plough lurched and staggered across the ground, and he was sowing the furrows not with seed, but with salt, staring straight through his visitors as though they were not standing there at all. A madman cannot swear oaths, and a madman cannot fight. It was, by any measure, a fine performance. Palamedes did not believe a word of it, and his test for the truth was as ruthless as it was simple. He lifted the infant Telemachus from his nurse's arms and set the baby down in the plough's own path. Odysseus swerved. Of course he swerved. And in that single instinctive movement, the whole disguise collapsed at once, because a man sane enough to save his son was plainly sane enough to go to war. So Odysseus went. He never forgave Palamedes for it, and years later, at Troy, he would take a cold, carefully engineered revenge, forging evidence that framed the man as a traitor and letting the army stone him for it. It is one of the darker threads sewn into this hero's story, and the poem itself politely never mentions it at all, though it is worth holding on to because it shows the other edge of the same blade. The very cleverness that will save Odysseus again and again in the tale ahead was also, at least once, capable of destroying an innocent man. And it did. Once caught, he threw himself into the war's preparation with the energy of someone who has decided the fastest road home runs straight through the middle of the fighting. He became the expedition's chief recruiter, and his most celebrated catch was a teenager hidden away on the island of Scyros, dressed in girls' clothing among the local king's own daughters, tucked there by a goddess mother who knew her son was fated to die at Troy if he ever went. That boy's name was Achilles, prophesied to become the finest warrior of his entire generation. Odysseus found him through a trick, naturally, arriving disguised as a travelling merchant and laying out his wares before the assembled girls, fine cloth, jewellery, and, mixed in quietly among them, a spear and a shield. Then he had a war trumpet sounded, as if in sudden alarm. The girls scattered in fright. One of them alone snatched up the spear and shield and stood ready to fight. Odysseus had found his man. By the time the full fleet gathered at the port of Aeolus, it was the largest armed force the Greek world had ever seen. Over 1,000 ships by the poet's count, drawn from every kingdom in Greece. Odysseus brought 12 ships of his own from Ithaca and the western islands, a modest squadron beside Agamemnon's 100, though the High King had not wanted him along for the size of his fleet. Then the wind died entirely, and the whole armada sat stranded in harbour until a priest declared that Agamemnon had offended the goddess Artemis and must pay her price. The sacrifice of his own daughter, Iphigenia, lured to the camp under the false promise of a wedding. The wind returned, the fleet sailed, and back in Mycenae, a queen named Clytemnestra began nursing a long, patient hatred toward her husband, one that would eventually finish what Troy itself could not. The 1,000 ships crossed the Aegean toward a war everyone still expected to be brief. It would take 10 years and the finest men of a whole generation, and somewhere in the middle of it, holding the entire fraying enterprise together with words, tricks, and sheer stubborn will, would be the man who had tried to plough his way out of coming. The Greeks could never fully seal the city off, and the Trojans, reinforced by allies drawn from across Anatolia, could never quite drive the invaders back into the sea. For years the fighting simply rolled back and forth across the plain between the walls and the ships, while Greek raiding parties struck the surrounding towns for food, treasure, and captives. In that long, grinding stalemate, different men proved their worth in different ways. Achilles was the spearhead, a terror on the battlefield worth an entire regiment on his own. Great Ajax was the wall, a massive man behind a massive shield who simply never broke. Agamemnon held the overall command, and old Nestor of Pylos supplied the seasoned counsel that kept younger tempers in check. Odysseus became something none of the others could be. He was the mind of the army. Whenever the Greeks needed a negotiator, it was Odysseus they sent. And before the fighting had even properly begun, he and Menelaus walked into Troy itself under diplomatic protection to stand before the Trojan assembly and demand Helen's return. Those who heard him speak that day remembered it for years afterward. At first, they said, he seemed to be nothing much at all, standing stiffly, eyes lowered, gripping the speaker's staff as if he had never once held one, and you might easily have taken him for an awkward, sullen man. Then he began to speak, and the words came like snowflakes falling in a winter storm, thick and relentless, and no man alive could match him. Troy refused the demand regardless. Some voices in that court wanted to hand Helen back and end the danger there and then, but old King Priam's council chose war instead. When the army's spirit cracked, it was Odysseus who mended it. In the 9th grinding year, Agamemnon made the mistake of testing his exhausted troops, suggesting they simply give up and sail home, fully expecting them to refuse out of pride. Instead, they cheered and bolted straight for the ships, and the entire 10-year campaign came within minutes of dissolving on the spot. It was Odysseus who ran through that scattering mob, snatched back the royal staff, shamed the officers, struck the loudest agitator down, and drove the whole army back to its assembly. He talked them back into a war they had just tried to abandon. No sword on that field accomplished more that single day. Whenever quarrels flared among the leadership, Odysseus was the one sent to settle them, and the most dangerous quarrel of all arrived late in the war, when Agamemnon insulted Achilles over a captive woman named Briseis. Achilles, the one indispensable man in the whole army, withdrew himself and his soldiers from the fighting entirely, and sat brooding in his tent, while Trojan attacks reached the Greek ships and set them alight. A humbled Agamemnon offered a fortune in gifts to win him back, and chose Odysseus to lead the embassy and make the case. Odysseus laid the offer out with every ounce of persuasive skill he possessed. Achilles refused him anyway, one of the very few recorded defeats for Odysseus in the art of talking, and it would take the death of his dearest friend Patroclus to accomplish what no words could. When the work required was simply dirty, Odysseus did that too. One black night, he and the warrior Diomedes slipped out past the camp to scout the enemy lines, and caught a Trojan spy named Dolon creeping in the opposite direction. They promised him his life in exchange for information, drained him of everything he knew, and killed him anyway. They then used what they had learned to raid the freshly arrived camp of a Thracian ally king named Rhesus, slaughtering him and a dozen of his men in their sleep and driving off his magnificent horses. On another occasion, Odysseus disguised himself as a beaten, bloodied beggar and slipped inside Troy's own walls to gather intelligence. Helen recognized him there and, weary of the whole war herself, kept his secret. Later still, he and Diomedes crept into the city one final time and carried off the Palladium, the sacred image of Athena on which prophecy said the very safety of Troy depended. You will notice that none of this is glorious in quite the way Achilles was glorious. Night raids, disguises, interrogations, theft. Homeric warfare kept its own code of honor, and Odysseus lived comfortably along its very edges. The Greeks themselves felt that tension keenly, and later centuries would argue about him endlessly, some celebrating the resourceful hero, others condemning the liar and schemer, so that he remains a rare figure in legend, who is at once the most admired and the most distrusted man in his own story. The war ground on regardless, consuming its great names one after another. Hector, the noble defender of Troy, fell in single combat beneath the walls to Achilles, who, half mad with grief for Patroclus, dragged the body behind his own chariot through the dust. Old King Priam himself crossed the plain alone at night to kneel before his son's killer and beg for the corpse, and Achilles, at last, relented and gave it back. That funeral truce is where the Iliad, the war's other great poem, quietly ends. But the war itself did not. Achilles died soon after, exactly as prophecy had always promised he would, brought down by an arrow from Paris, guided, the poet said, by the god Apollo himself, striking the one vulnerable point on his entire body, the heel that has carried his name into every language spoken since. The greatest warrior of that age burned at last on a pyre by the shore of a foreign sea. The army settled the ownership of that armour by vote, some accounts say with captured Trojans standing as the jury, and the prize went to Odysseus. The mind, in the end, had been weighed heavier than the muscle. Ajax could not carry that verdict. By night his sanity gave way entirely. Athena clouded his thinking, and he fell upon the army's own herds of sheep and cattle in the darkness, slaughtering them by the hundred, utterly convinced he was cutting down Odysseus, Agamemnon, and every commander who had ever wronged him. When morning came, and he finally saw what he had actually done, standing among the slaughtered animals, the shame was more than a hero of his stature could carry. He drove his own sword point up into the earth and fell upon it. The Greeks lost their second greatest warrior not to Troy at all, but to their own prize-giving. Odysseus, to his lasting credit, argued afterward against Agamemnon's wishes that Ajax deserved an honourable burial regardless. He had only ever wanted the armour, never the ruin that followed it. So the 10th year found the Greek army victorious in nearly every way that no longer mattered. Their finest fighters lay dead or spent. Troy's champion Hector was gone, Paris himself was eventually killed, and the city sat hungry, battered, and stripped of allies. And still the walls stood, the gates held, and no Greek soldier had ever once set foot inside them. Prophecies were gathered up and checked off, one by one, like items on a list. Fetch the bow of Heracles. Bring the son of Achilles into the war. Steal the sacred Palladium. Odysseus arranged every last one of them, and still the city refused to fall. 10 years of bloodshed had proven exactly one thing beyond any argument. Troy could not be taken by force. If it fell at all, it would have to fall to something else entirely. And on the shore beside the ships, the man who had spent a decade as the army's mind began quietly turning over an idea involving carpentry, an empty beach, and the single most famous piece of livestock in human history. When Odysseus finally laid the plan out before the other commanders, it must have sounded, at first, almost like a joke. The mightiest army of the age had failed to break Troy across 10 full years of open war. So the new plan was simply to stop trying, and to leave a gift behind instead. Under the hands of a craftsman named Epeus, and with Athena's own guidance, the Greeks built an enormous hollow horse of polished wooden planks, tall as a siege tower, finished as beautifully as any offering ever laid before a god. Hidden inside its belly was a concealed chamber, room enough for a chosen force of armed men, the exact number shifting from telling to telling, anywhere from a couple of dozen to more than 50, though every version agrees on who led them. Odysseus sat inside his own invention in the dark, packed in among the finest warriors Greece had left. Then came the hardest part of the whole scheme. The army simply vanished. The Greeks burned their own camp, dragged their ships back into the water, and sailed off in plain sight of the walls, leaving the great horse standing alone on the empty shore. The fleet did not sail home at all, only just over the horizon to the island of Tenedos, where it waited. One man stayed behind on purpose, a volunteer for what may be the bravest, least celebrated job of the entire war. His name was Sinon, and his task was simply to be captured. Dragged from the marshes before the Trojans, he spun them a careful story, that the Greeks had given up and sailed for home, and left the horse behind as an offering to Athena, atoning for the theft of her sacred image. He claimed it had been built deliberately oversized so that the Trojans could never drag it through their own gates, since a prophecy warned that any city holding that horse within its walls would stand untouchable forever. He claimed, too, that the Greeks had meant to sacrifice him to the gods for a safe voyage home, and that he alone had escaped, and now hated his own countrymen for it. Nearly every detail had almost certainly been engineered by Odysseus himself, built not to push the Trojans toward the horse, but to pull them toward it willingly. Not everyone was fooled. A Trojan priest named Laestrygonian warned against accepting the gift with a line that has outlived the war itself, saying he feared Greeks even bearing gifts, and he hurled his spear into the horse's wooden flank, where it stood quivering in the grain. Inside, the hidden men held their breath. Then, before the eyes of the whole city, 2 enormous serpents rose from the sea and crushed Laestrygonian and his sons where they stood, and the Trojans read it, naturally, as divine judgment against a man who had insulted a sacred gift. The princess Cassandra, cursed by Apollo to speak the truth and never once be believed, cried out that the horse was full of armed men. The city laughed at her, exactly as it always did. So the Trojans broke open their own wall to haul their prize inside, dragging the horse up to the citadel on ropes and rollers, wreathing it in flowers, and throwing the largest celebration the city had ever known. 10 years of siege, they believed, were finally over, and they drank the way people drink when a long war ends, until, by the small hours, Troy lay asleep for the first time in a decade, with no watch worth the name left standing. But inside the horse, in the dark, there had already been one last test of nerve. Helen herself had come down at evening to circle the great wooden shape, calling out to the hidden men inside, imitating, whether from suspicion or mischief, or some divided loyalty of her own, the voices of their distant wives. And one of the warriors, hearing his own wife's voice after 10 long years, very nearly answered. Odysseus clamped a hand over the man's mouth and held it there until Helen finally gave up and walked away. Some later tellings claim he held that grip until the man had been silenced permanently, rather than risk a single sound escaping. And that detail is very likely a later flourish, added by tellers who wanted the moment sharper. But it captures something true about that night all the same. The war, the fleet, every life packed into that wooden belly, all of it hung on nothing but silence. Deep in the darkness, Cicones slipped away and lit a signal fire. On Tenedos, the waiting fleet caught the light and turned back toward shore, and inside the citadel, a hatch swung open in the horse's hollow flank, and Odysseus led his men down a rope ladder into the sleeping heart of Troy. They killed the few remaining sentries, threw open the gates, and let the returning army pour through. What followed was not a battle, it was the sack of a city, and the old poets never softened it. The Trojans woke to fire and screaming, armed men already loose in their own streets. Some fought back magnificently and hopelessly, half-armed in doorways and courtyards, while Priam's own palace became a slaughterhouse. The old king pulled on armour his aging body could no longer bear, and his wife Hecuba drew him back toward the household altar instead, the most sacred place of refuge his world knew. It did not save him. Neoptolemus, the teenage son of the dead Achilles, killed Priam at that very altar, one of the great sacrileges of that whole terrible night. Cassandra fled to Athena's temple and clung to the goddess's own statue, and a Greek commander known as Ajax the Lesser, a different man entirely from great Ajax, tore her from it and violated her inside the sanctuary itself. Hector's small son was thrown from the walls, killed as a child so that he could never grow into an avenger. The royal women, queens and princesses of the richest city in that world, were divided among the victors like property. Hector's widow was given to the very son of the man who had killed her husband. Old Hecuba went to Odysseus. By morning, Troy stood as smoking ruin, and everything the Greeks had crossed the sea for now sat loaded in their ships. Helen was returned to Menelaus, who had sworn for years to kill her the instant he saw her, and found, standing before her at last, that he simply could not. Here is the turn in the tale that ancient audiences understood in their bones, the piece we need to hold on to make sense of everything still ahead. The Greeks had won their war, and in winning it, they had lost the gods. Greek religion was never a religion of mercy, but it was a religion of limits. Altars were sacred ground. Temples were sacred ground. Anyone who placed themselves under a god's protection was meant to be untouchable. On the night Troy fell, drunk on 10 pent-up years of rage, the victors broke every one of those limits at once. Athena, who had backed the Greeks the entire war and helped design the horse herself, turned against them overnight because of the outrage done to Cassandra inside her own temple. And when the army failed to punish the man responsible, her fury settled over the whole returning fleet. The journeys home became a second catastrophe entirely. The Greeks quarrelled even before they set sail, splitting their fleet apart. Storms scattered the ships across the eastern Mediterranean. Ajax the Lesser was wrecked and dragged himself onto a bare rock, boasting that he had survived despite the gods themselves, and Poseidon answered that boast by smashing him straight into the sea. Menelaus was blown off course to Egypt and wandered there for 7 long years. Agamemnon reached home the fastest of anyone, which turned out to be the worst luck of all, since his wife Clytemnestra, who had spent 10 years nursing the memory of the daughter he sacrificed at Aeolus, welcomed him with a red carpet a bath, and a blade. The High King of the Greeks, conqueror of Troy, was butchered inside his own house on the very day of his return. And Odysseus, who had built the horse and effectively won the war, put out to sea from the smoking ruin with his 12 ships and roughly 600 men, expecting, like every man among them, to be home within a few short weeks. The gods had other plans. So, in all fairness, did Odysseus's own choices. Fitting, perhaps, that the city he had helped burn would be avenged on him not by armies at all, but by geography, weather, hunger, and one enormous, furious shepherd waiting somewhere down the road. The journey proper begins here. 12 ships stood off the Trojan coast in early summer light, riding low in the water under the weight of plunder, each one a black, open galley of the Bronze Age style, some 50 men aboard, a single mast with one square sail, and rowing benches for the hours the wind refused to help. No decks to sleep beneath, no cabins, no compass, no charts of any kind. Sailors of that age steered by coastlines, landmarks, the stars overhead, and sheer accumulated memory, beaching their ships each night whenever they possibly could, since the open sea after dark was no place for a sensible man to linger. The route home was simple enough, and every man aboard already knew it by heart. Southwest along the coast of Asia Minor, island by island across the Aegean, around the southern capes of Greece, then north along the western shore to Ithaca, some 560 miles in all, a few weeks of sailing at most. Some of these men had been mere boys when they first left home. Now they were men in their 30s, with sons of their own, like Telemachus, nearly grown without them. Every hour of sailing brought them an hour closer to faces they had spent 10 years struggling to remember. And at the very first opportunity, they threw that closeness away. The coast of Thrace lay near their homeward route, and on it stood the city of Ismarus, home to a people called the Cicones, long-time allies of Troy. To a battle-worn Bronze Age fleet, an enemy city with its army already gone was never a place to sail past. It was simply a target. Raiding carried no shame in that world, or rather, piracy itself was never considered shameful. It was what armed men in ships did, an accepted road to riches for any king bold enough to take it, and after 10 years of war, falling into it again was practically a reflex. Odysseus gave the order, and the fleet fell on Ismarus. The raid went the way these things always went. The town was sacked, its men cut down, its women and its treasure divided out among the crews. Telling this story himself, years later, Odysseus is almost entirely matter-of-fact about it. And it is worth pausing on that, because this is our very first look at the hero away from the war, and he does not look much like a hero at all here. He looks like exactly what he is, a Bronze Age warlord doing the ordinary business of a Bronze Age warlord. The old poem never apologizes for this. It simply shows it, and then, quite deliberately, it shows the bill that comes due afterward. Reading the situation clearly, Odysseus ordered an immediate withdrawal back to the ships. His crews refused him outright. There was wine spilled across the sand, sheep and cattle already slaughtered, and after a full decade of army rations, they intended to have their feast regardless of orders. They ate and drank their way through the afternoon and deep into the night, while survivors of Ismarus slipped inland to raise their kinsmen, the Cicones of the interior, a people numerous, warlike, and unusually skilled with chariots. At dawn, the counterattack arrived. In numbers Homer compares to leaves in springtime, and the Greeks, heavy with wine and mutton, were forced to form up on an open beach against troops far fresher than themselves. They held their line through the morning. By afternoon it broke entirely, and the crews scrambled for their ships under a hail of falling spears. Once they were clear of the shore and the heads were finally counted. The arithmetic was brutal. 6 men lost from every single ship, some 72 dead in all, traded for a pile of stolen goods and a single night's feast. The fleet pulled away in silence, and Odysseus records that they called out the names of their dead 3 times across the water before setting their course, so that no ghost would be left behind unmourned. It is an ugly little episode, and it sits at the very front of the voyage on purpose. Before a single monster appears, before any god intervenes, the whole shape of this journey has already been set in miniature at Ismarus. Odysseus gives a sound order. The crew disobeys it for the sake of appetite. Men die for that disobedience. Hold on to that pattern, because it will repeat again and again, at larger and larger cost, until there is no crew left at all to disobey him. The fleet ran on southwest with a following wind, nursing its wounds, and made for the southern tip of Greece, passing the island of Cythera before reaching the last great obstacle on the homeward route, Cape Malea, the southeastern fingertip of the mainland. Here we should pause on geography for a moment, because Cape Malea is no invention. It is a real headland, and real sailors have feared it for as long as ships have sailed those waters. The mountains crowding the cape twist and funnel the wind, the currents run treacherous, and weather sweeping down from the north can hurl a vessel away from land faster than any oarsman can answer it. The ancient Greeks kept a proverb about the place: round Malea and forget your home. Ships wrecked there by the hundred across the age of sail, and modern archaeologists have since found the seafloor around it littered with cargo spanning thousands of years. Odysseus's fleet reached Malea, turned the corner and stood, for one brief moment, nearly home. Ithaca lay perhaps a week's sailing away. Then the north wind came down like a closed fist. The storm caught all 12 ships at the very worst possible place and drove them bodily off the cape, south past Cythera and out into open water. For 2 days and nights they simply ran before it, sails torn, powerless to claw their way back. On the 3rd day, the sky finally cleared and they raised sail again and tried to beat their way north, but the wind and the current refused to allow it. 9 days, Odysseus tells us, the winds carried them on across a sea thick with fish, away from every coastline any man aboard had ever seen or even heard described. 9 days is the poem's own quiet way of drawing a line across the map and then erasing it entirely. Somewhere within those 9 days, the fleet sailed clean out of the known world. Everything before Malea is real geography. Places you could visit even today. Troy, Ismarus, Cythera, the Cape itself. Everything that follows belongs to a wholly different kind of space. A sea of islands charted on no map, home to beings that answer to no human rule. Ancient readers argued for centuries over where the Lotus-Eaters or the Cyclops were really meant to live, hopefully pinning them to Libya or Sicily, and the geographer Eratosthenes, a thoroughly sensible man, once remarked that you would find the true route of Odysseus the same day you found the cobbler who stitched shut the bag of the winds, meaning, gently, that you never would. For the men actually aboard those ships, none of this was a literary transition. It was slow, dawning dread. Bronze Age sailors lived by known coastlines, the way we live by roads, and they were now beyond every one of them, running on guesswork, their water skins going flat, with no notion of what shore, if any, might rise ahead. 10 years of war had at least been 10 years spent in a known place. This was something altogether new, the particular fear of being lost, which is a different animal from the fear of being attacked, and in some ways worse, since there is nothing in it a man can actually fight. On the 10th day, a low green coastline finally lifted over the horizon. The ships ran in, found fresh water, and the exhausted crews took a meal on the beach from whatever supplies remained. It seemed, on the surface, a gentle place. No walls, no chariots, no spear points catching the light on the hills. Odysseus, grown cautious after Ismarus, chose not to land his whole force this time. He picked out 2 sailors and a herald, 3 men in all, and sent them inland with the simplest instruction imaginable. Find out who lives here and whether they eat bread, which was simply the old Greek way of asking whether the people of this shore were civilized at all. The 3 men walked into the green interior of that country and did not return. This was the land of the Lotus-Eaters, and its people proved, by every outward measure, the gentlest hosts Odysseus would meet anywhere on his whole voyage. They did not attack the scouts. They did not rob them, enslave them, or hold them for ransom. They welcomed the strangers in, sat them down, and shared their food, exactly what the sacred law of hospitality asked of any host. That food was the fruit of the lotus, a sweet, flowering plant that made up the whole of their diet, and, as far as anyone could tell, the whole of their civilization besides. And whoever tasted it simply stopped wanting to go home. That is the entire mechanism of this episode, and its quiet horror. The lotus poisoned no body and enslaved no will. The scouts remained awake, healthy, comfortable, perfectly content. They simply no longer cared about Ithaca at all. The wives and children they had spent 10 hard years fighting to return to faded gently into a pleasant irrelevance, like a story that had happened to someone else entirely. All they wanted now was to remain exactly where they were, eating lotus, forever. Given everything these particular men had already survived to reach even this shore, war, storm, the blood-soaked beach at Ismarus, there is something almost merciful in the offer. The lotus gave them the one thing no god in this story had thought to give: an end to wanting anything at all. Odysseus recognized the danger instantly, and his response tells you a great deal about the man. He did not negotiate. He did not send a second party in after the first. He certainly did not sample the fruit himself to judge the threat firsthand. He went in personally, with a small rescue party, seized his 3 weeping scouts by force, dragged them back to the ships as they begged to be allowed to stay, and lashed them down to the rowing benches. Then he ordered the entire crew back out to sea immediately, before a single other man could taste what the 3 had tasted, and the fleet pulled away from that gentle coast at speed, 3 of its own sailors bound down and sobbing for the shore behind them. It is a small episode, barely a few dozen lines in the original poem, with no battle in it and no body count at all. And yet, the poet set it first among every strange encounter of the whole voyage, ahead of giants, witches and monsters alike. And thinkers have been unpacking it ever since, because the Lotus-Eaters quietly establish what this entire epic is actually about, and it was never really seafaring. It is memory, and the exhausting effort of continuing to want something difficult when something effortless sits within easy reach. Consider the shape of the threat carefully. Every other danger on this voyage will attack the body. The lotus attacks the homecoming itself, the wanting of it, the very engine that gives the whole journey its meaning. A man killed by a monster simply dies on his way home. A man who eats the lotus is worse than dead in this poem's own terms, because the road home no longer exists anywhere inside him. Nothing has been taken from him except the wanting. And without the wanting, he is no longer travelling anywhere at all. He is simply alive, indefinitely, pleasantly, in a place that was never his. The Greeks had a word sitting at the very centre of this poem, nostos, meaning homecoming, the hero's return across the sea. Set beside it another word, algos, meaning pain. And you get a word actually coined many centuries later by a Swiss medical student describing homesick soldiers. Nostalgia, the ache of return. The Odyssey stands as the founding document of that particular ache, and the Lotus-Eaters are its founding warning that the ache can, in fact, be cured, and that the cure looks very much like a kind of death. Odysseus drags his men back to their benches, not because the lotus will hurt them, but because it will make them stop hurting. And the hurt is the only compass any of them still carry. Notice, too, exactly who gave in and who did not. The scouts ate. Odysseus did not. And this pattern holds through the entire voyage. His crew reaches for whatever sits closest in front of them: food, wine, plunder, sleep, safety. While Odysseus, whatever his other failings, keeps reaching instead for the harder thing further away. Not because temptation cannot touch him. Later episodes will show him tempted quite badly indeed, by comfort, by glory, even by immortality itself. But he can hold a future clearly enough in his mind to outweigh a present pleasure, and most of his men, brave as they undoubtedly are, simply cannot. In the quiet arithmetic of this poem, that one capacity, more than strength, more than courage, is what separates the single man who makes it home from the 600 who never will. People have wondered for a very long time whether a real plant hides somewhere behind this story. Ancient writers went looking themselves, and Herodotus, the great travelling historian, reported a people on the North African coast who lived on the sweet fruit of an actual shrub the Greeks also called the lotus. That plant still grows there today, a modest relative of the jujube, pleasant and entirely harmless, which rather undersells the legend it inspired. Others have pointed instead to the blue water lily of the Nile, with its mild, sedative properties, or to the opium poppy, already cultivated across the Bronze Age Mediterranean, whose effects on a person's motivation need no further explanation. The honest answer is that Homer was never writing botany. Whatever seed of traveller's gossip started the story, the poet shaped it into something no actual plant could ever be, a pure image of forgetting, and it remains just as recognizable now as it was 2,700 years ago. Every age since has had no trouble at all naming its own particular lotus. The fleet stood back out to sea and left the Lotus-Eaters exactly as it had found them, mild, generous, and going nowhere. The only people in this entire epic who never harmed a single soul and never will. Behind the ships, their green country slowly sank into the haze. On the rowing benches, the three rescued men wept themselves quiet, and then, as the fruit's hold gradually faded with the widening distance, came back to themselves and their oars, remembering, perhaps with rather mixed feelings, that they had wives and debts and a very long way to go. Ahead lay open water and in time another landfall, a rugged coastline of mountains and forest under a smoke-grey sky. This next country did not look gentle, and it was not. Its people planted nothing, ploughed nothing, built no ships, held no assemblies, and kept no laws in common, each family answering only to itself inside its own cave in the hills. Even from the water, the Greeks could make out the mouths of those caves, the great stone folds and pens built for flocks, and here and there, moving on the slopes, shapes that seemed, at that distance, surely some trick of the failing light, since they were simply far too large to be men. Odysseus studied that shore, and his curiosity, the very trait that had made him great and would soon cost him dearly, began to stir. A smaller island lay offshore, wooded and thick with wild goats, safe and empty of any threat. The sensible course was to water the ships there, feast on goat meat, and sail on. The fleet did exactly that, anchoring and feasting through the evening. And then, come morning, Odysseus announced he would take only his own single ship across to the mainland, to learn what manner of beings lived in those caves, whether they feared the gods, and whether they honoured guests with gifts. He would get his answer to all three questions. They were the worst answers available. Odysseus crossed with one ship, choosing 12 of his finest men for the shore party and leaving the rest to guard the vessel. He also carried something that looks, at first glance, like an odd item for a scouting mission. A goatskin of extraordinarily strong wine. A gift from a priest of Apollo, whose family he had spared back at Ismarus. So potent that its owner mixed a single portion with 20 of water. He brought it along, he later admitted, because something in him already sensed he was about to meet a savage stranger, huge and lawless. Keep that wine in mind. It is the whole story yet to come. They found the cave without difficulty, a great hollow in the cliffs by the sea, fenced with a yard of quarried stone and tall pines. Its owner was out with his flocks, and inside, the Greeks discovered the home of a remarkably orderly monster. Pens of lambs and kids sorted carefully by age, racks of cheese, pails of milk and whey, everything tidy and well kept. The crew, sensibly, wanted to grab some cheese and lambs, run for the ship, and leave. Odysseus refused. He wanted to see the owner himself, he admitted afterward, and learn whether the creature would offer a guest gift. 10 years of war had taught him a great many things, but apparently not when to stop being curious. So they lit a fire, helped themselves to the cheese, and waited for their host to come home. He arrived at evening, driving his flocks ahead of him and carrying an enormous load of firewood, which he dropped with a crash loud enough to send the Greeks scrambling into the shadows at the back of the cave. Then he rolled a boulder across the entrance, a stone so vast, the poem tells us, that 22 wagons together could never have shifted it. And there, hidden in the dark, the Greeks got their first proper look at him. His name was Polyphemus, a Cyclops, one of a race of one-eyed giants, and, as it happened, a son of Poseidon, god of the sea. He milked his ewes and goats in perfect order, set aside half for cheese and half for his own supper, then built up the fire again, and by its light he finally saw the men. What followed is one of the most chilling scenes in ancient literature, precisely because it begins as simple etiquette. Odysseus stepped forward and delivered a proper, formal speech. They were Greeks, he said, bound home from Troy, blown badly off their course, and they came to him now as guests, hoping for the hospitality or the parting gift that custom demanded, reminding the giant that Zeus himself watches over strangers and answers any wrong done to them. It was the correct speech, the one that had worked on every civilized shore in the Greek world. Polyphemus answered that the Cyclops cared nothing at all for Zeus or any god, being, in his own reckoning, stronger than gods, and then asked, almost idly, where their ship lay moored. Odysseus, lying smoothly even here, claimed it had been wrecked on the rocks, and that these men were its only survivors. Polyphemus made no reply to that at all. He simply lunged, seized 2 of the sailors, and killed them where he stood, before eating them entirely, while the rest looked on in helpless horror and lifted their hands to a Zeus who did nothing to stop him. Then he washed the meal down with milk, stretched out among his own flock, and slept. Consider the position Odysseus found himself in at that moment, because it is a nearly perfect trap. His sword hung at his side, and he was seriously tempted to creep over in the dark and end the giant then and there. He stopped himself with a single piece of cold reasoning. The boulder. If Polyphemus died, the cave's door would stay sealed forever, since no number of men together could shift that stone alone. Killing the monster meant simply starving to death beside his body. The jailer had to survive, at least long enough to open his own prison. Whatever escape existed would have to leave the giant alive enough to move that stone, and somehow unable to stop them passing through it once he had. It is, viewed from a distance, a genuinely elegant problem being solved in total darkness by a man listening to his own friends being killed. Morning came, and Polyphemus took 2 more men for his breakfast, before driving his flocks out to pasture and rolling the boulder back into place behind him as easily as a man seals a jar. And through that long, locked day, trapped inside with the dead, Odysseus built his plan. In the cave lay a great club of green olive wood, thick as a ship's mast, and from it Odysseus cut a length as long as a man's outstretched arms. His men shaved it smooth, sharpened one end to a point, hardened that point in the fire's edge, and hid the whole stake beneath the heaped dung at the back of the cave. Then they drew lots for the 4 who would help him drive it home, and the lots, Odysseus notes with quiet satisfaction, fell on precisely the men he would have chosen himself, regardless. Evening came, and the giant returned and ate 2 more of them. 6 gone now of the 12 who had walked in. And now came the wine. Odysseus filled a bowl with the priest's own undiluted vintage and offered it to Polyphemus politely, as though it was simply the proper drink to accompany a meal of human flesh. The giant drained it and demanded more, and then more again, and softening horribly with every cup, offered his guest a gift of his own in return, and asked, almost warmly, for his name. The answer Odysseus gave has become the most famous lie in all of Western literature. "My name," he said, "is nobody. That is what my mother and my father and all my friends have always called me. Nobody." Delighted with his own cleverness, drunk and pleased, Polyphemus announced his guest gift in return. He would eat nobody last, after all his companions. Then he toppled backward and fell into a stupor so deep that he vomited in his sleep. The Greeks pulled the stake from its hiding place and heated its point in the embers until the green wood glowed and was ready to catch. A god breathed courage into them then, Odysseus says, and they needed every bit of it. 4 men lifted the beam together. Odysseus guided its point, and they drove it into the giant's single closed eye, and leaned their full weight against it, Odysseus turning it from above the way a shipwright turns a drill. Polyphemus woke screaming, tore the stake free, and bellowed for help, and his fellow Cyclopes came running through the night from their own scattered caves, gathering outside the sealed boulder to ask what was wrong. Was someone stealing his flocks? Was someone killing him by treachery or violence? And from inside the cave came his anguished answer, "Nobody is killing me. Nobody by treachery." His neighbours weighed this for a moment, decided that if nobody was harming him, his trouble must be some private business between him and Zeus, and told him to pray to his father Poseidon about it, then went back to their beds. The trap sprung exactly as designed. The victim's own cry for help had sent his rescuers away, but the blinded giant still held the door, rolling the boulder just far enough aside to sit in the gap himself, arms spread wide, feeling for anyone who tried to slip past among the sheep. Monster or not, he was no fool, so Odysseus produced his second device. Working quietly in the dark, he lashed the giant's own fat, woolly rams together in threes with willow branches pulled from the monster's own bedding, and beneath the belly of each middle ram he tied one of his men, shielded on either side by the animals flanking him. For himself, he chose the largest ram in the whole flock and clung beneath it by hand, buried deep in its fleece. At dawn, the rams pushed out to pasture as they did every morning, and Polyphemus ran his hands along the back of each one as it passed, feeling nothing but wool. His favourite, the great ram carrying Odysseus, came last of all, and the giant paused, spoke gently to it, wondering aloud why the leader of his flock moved so slowly today, whether it grieved for its master's ruined eye, and promising, almost tenderly, what he would do to nobody if he ever caught him. Then he let the animal pass. Sometimes the most unsettling moment in any such story is the gentle one. Once clear of the boulder and out of arm's reach, the Greeks slipped free of the rams, ran for their ship, driving the stolen flock ahead of them, and pulled hard for open water. 6 men fewer than had walked ashore, but alive and free and clear at last. That should have been the end of it. It very nearly was, except for nobody's own fatal pride. The ship pulled away from the coast of the Cyclops, oars beating fast, the stolen rams bleating in the hold, while behind them, on the cliff top, the blinded giant felt his way along the rocks, following the sound of the rowing. Silence was the only sensible course now. Every stroke bought distance, and distance meant safety, and every man at the oars understood as much. Odysseus could not help himself. Once the ship had reached about the distance a shout can carry, he stood and delivered one anyway. "Cyclops," he called out across the water, "if anyone asks how you lost your eye, tell them it was your own doing, for devouring guests inside your own house, and that Zeus and the gods have paid you back for it." The answer came instantly, and nearly proved fatal. Polyphemus wrenched the peak from a hillside and hurled it toward the sound of the voice, and the rock crashed down just ahead of the bow, the wave it threw driving the ship back toward the beach so hard the crew had to fight the surge and row for their very lives. His men begged Odysseus, in every way they knew how, to stop provoking a creature capable of throwing mountains. He would not stop. This is the hinge the entire voyage turns on, so let it unfold slowly. The ship clawed its way out to twice the distance, and Odysseus rose a second time, and now his own shipmates physically tried to hold him down and talk him out of it. It made no difference. Something in him needed the monster to know the truth. "Cyclops," he shouted across the water, "if anyone asks who blinded you, tell them it was no nobody. Tell them it was Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, whose home lies on Ithaca. Name, title, father, and home address." He gave the monster everything. To understand why a clever man would do something so catastrophically foolish, you have to understand exactly what a name meant in his world. The trick with nobody had saved 12 lives, but it carried a hidden cost. As long as the giant believed nobody had beaten him, then in the strict accounting of fame that Greek heroes lived and died by, nobody truly had. The deed existed, the credit did not. Heroes of that age lived for kleos, the glory of having your name fixed permanently to your deeds and carried down through the generations in song. And an anonymous triumph was, in that particular currency, worth nothing at all. Standing in that boat, Odysseus was choosing between safety and his own signature, and he chose the signature. It is the same appetite that had walked him into the cave in the first place, and it was about to be priced with brutal accuracy, because here is what he did not yet know. Polyphemus was no ordinary shepherd. He was a son of Poseidon, god of the sea and shaker of the earth, the second most powerful being in the entire Greek cosmos. A curse, in Greek belief, was never a vague expression of ill will. It functioned as something closer to a formal, legal petition, addressed directly to a god. And to file one effectively, you needed the offender's true name. Odysseus had just shouted his own across the water, with his father's name and home port attached, like a man handing over his complete identification to the plaintiff in his own lawsuit. Polyphemus lifted both hands toward the starry sky and prayed. "Hear me, Poseidon, dark-haired encircler of the earth. If I am truly your son, grant that Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, whose home lies on Ithaca, may never reach that home again. But if it is fated that he must, then let him arrive late and broken, having lost every last companion aboard a stranger's ship, and let him find nothing but trouble waiting inside his own house." Read that curse back carefully, because it lays out the entire remaining plot of this story in advance, item by item. Late, broken, every companion lost, a stranger's ship, trouble in the house. Poseidon heard his son and granted every word of it. Then Polyphemus hurled a second boulder, which missed the stern and, rather unhelpfully for him, only washed the ship further out to sea, and the giant passes out of this story now, though never out of its consequences. One more detail from that cave deserves to travel with us, since Homer plants it quietly here and lets it bloom much later. Among the plunder, Odysseus had kept the great ram that carried him to freedom, and back on the Goat Island, reunited at last with the rest of the fleet, he sacrificed it to Zeus, burning the thigh bones to the king of the gods and asking, quite reasonably, for a safe voyage home. Zeus, the poem tells us bluntly, ignored the offering entirely. The god of guests had just watched 6 of his own suppliants eaten alive in that cave, true, but he had also watched the whole disaster begin with uninvited men helping themselves to a stranger's cheese. And more to the point, he was already quietly planning the destruction of the fleet for reasons entirely his own. The gods of this poem keep their own accounts, and those accounts rarely resemble ours. From this moment forward, the voyage carries an adversary with a specific, personal grievance, and that single fact changes the nature of everything still ahead. Storms are no longer simply weather. Currents are no longer simply chance. The sea itself, the very road home, the medium every remaining mile must cross, now belongs to the enemy. Poseidon cannot kill Odysseus outright, since fate, which binds even the gods, has already decreed that he will reach home eventually. But everything short of outright killing him remains fully permitted. And Poseidon, it turns out, has a very long list of things that fall short of killing a man. Modern readers sometimes wonder whether the punishment truly fits the crime. Polyphemus, after all, had eaten 6 men, and blinding him reads as self-defense in its plainest form, while even the taunting, reckless as it was, hardly seems to earn a decade of persecution and 600 deaths. The old answer is uncomfortable, but consistent. These gods do not punish in proportion. They punish in response, guided by their own sense of honor and their own attachments. Poseidon is not weighing evidence here. He is simply a father whose son has been maimed, and he happens to have the power to turn his anger directly into weather. Part of what the Odyssey teaches, patiently, across its entire length, is the shape of a universe run by beings with human passions and inhuman power, and how a mortal man survives inside it. The answer is never innocence. Odysseus is not innocent here. The answer is endurance. There is one further lesson hidden in this whole affair, one Odysseus himself will prove he eventually learned, though the tuition costs him years to pay. The next time we hear of him withholding his own name, and there will be a next time, it will happen inside a foreign king's hall with everything at stake, and he will hold it back through feast after feast, through tears, until the single moment of greatest advantage. And on the very day he finally walks back into his own house, he will do it as nobody again, an anonymous beggar in his own hall, holding that disguise through insult after insult for days on end, even as men hurl furniture at him. The man who could not stay silent in a rowboat for even 5 minutes will, in time, become the most patient liar in all of literature. The Odyssey is, among other things, the story of that particular education, and the first installment of tuition was paid right here in this cave. The 12 ships gathered, divided Polyphemus's sheep fairly among the crews, feasted, and slept that night on the beach. At dawn they rowed out in formation, grieving their dead and glad of their own remaining lives, unaware that a curse was now travelling with them, written directly into the water beneath their keels. Their next landfall, for once, looked like genuine good fortune. A floating island ringed with a wall of gleaming bronze, ruled by a cheerful king with a most unusual gift to offer. For 30 days, everything was about to go right. Then, a single piece of luggage would undo the entire world. the Bag of Winds. The island of Aeolus was unlike anything the Greeks had ever seen. It floated free on the open sea, unanchored to any seabed, ringed by an unbroken wall of bronze rising sheer from the cliffs. Its ruler was Aeolus, and Zeus had granted him a singular office in the machinery of the world. He was keeper of the winds, every gale, breeze and hurricane on earth, answering to this one remarkably cheerful administrator on his floating island. Aeolus lived there with his wife and their 12 children, 6 sons and 6 daughters, having solved the difficulty of finding suitable matches for them in so remote a place by simply marrying the sons to the daughters. The whole family feasted together daily in a house full of good things, and the poem reports this arrangement without a flicker of judgment, which perhaps tells us that even the poet decided some questions were better left where they lay. Far more importantly for the voyage, Aeolus proved a genuinely good host, the very first the travellers had met since leaving Troy. He took Odysseus and his crews in and entertained them for a full month, asking every evening for more of the story. Troy, the horse, the sack, the long voyage since, all of it. And when the Greeks finally asked leave to go, Aeolus did something no other host in this whole epic ever manages. He actually solved their problem. He took the hide of a 9-year-old ox and fashioned from it a great bag, and into that bag he packed every wind on earth save one, the entire howling inventory, the northern gales that had wrecked them off Malaya, every crosswind and storm, all of it bound shut inside the leather with a bright silver cord, sealed so tightly not a single breath could escape. Then he stowed the bag in the hold of Odysseus's own ship and set loose the one remaining wind, a steady, gentle breeze out of the west, to carry the whole fleet directly home. It was less a gift than a guarantee. With every contrary wind on earth locked away below deck, nothing in the sky could stop them, and for a while, nothing did. For 9 days and 9 nights, that west wind carried the 12 ships eastward without a single mishap, the longest run of pure good fortune in the entire 10-year voyage. Odysseus, who trusted no one by this point in his life, would not let another man so much as touch the rope that controlled the sail. He steered and managed it entirely himself, day and night, without sleep, for the whole 9 days straight. Hold that fact carefully in your mind. On the 10th day, they sighted Ithaca, and not as some distant smudge either. They came in close enough to see the fires burning on their own home island. Close enough, the poem suggests, to make out figures moving beside them. 10 years of war and a year of wandering, 600 men whittled down by cannibal giants and cyclopean stones, and there, at last, lay the actual coastline of home, the harbours they had grown up beside, an hour or two of easy sailing away. Some of those very fires may have been burning in their own households. And Odysseus, with the end finally in sight, the rope still in his hand, felt 9 sleepless days land on him all at once. He decided the danger had passed. He lay down on the deck, and he slept. What happened next happened quietly, in murmurs among the crew. There lay the captain, asleep at last, and there in the hold sat the bag, the mysterious bag he had guarded like treasure the entire way, the one he would not let anyone touch or even ask about. The men began to talk among themselves, and the poem lets us overhear it. "Look at him," they said. "Everywhere he goes he is honoured and loaded with gifts, carrying home piles of plunder from Troy, while we, after all the same miles and the same fighting, carry home nothing but empty hands. And now Aeolus has given him this, surely a bag of silver and gold. Let us just take a quick look," they told one another, "and see how much treasure lies inside." Try for a moment to be fair to them. They had bled and rowed through everything their captain had endured, and genuinely had nothing at all to show for it. He had told them nothing about the bag, and secrecy from a man already famous for cunning invites exactly one kind of guess. They were not mutineers. They were tired, poor, envious men, within sight of their own chimney smoke, taking one quick, unauthorized peek at the luggage. 99 times out of 100, that story ends in mere embarrassment, not disaster. They untied the silver cord. Every wind on earth burst from the bag at once. The hurricane that erupted from the hold seized all 12 ships and flung them away from Ithaca as the crews howled in despair. And Odysseus woke into the roar of it, into the sight of his own home island, being torn away over the horizon by the very cargo he had personally carried aboard. He tells us himself what passed through his mind in that moment. He seriously considered stepping over the side and letting the sea simply take him. He weighed drowning against enduring, and chose, in his own flat words, to endure, covering his head with his cloak and lying motionless while the storm tore his life apart around him. It may be the darkest sentence he speaks anywhere in the whole epic, and it is spoken about a disaster caused by neither monster nor god, but by his own crew's small jealousy and his own decision at last to sleep. The storm drove the fleet with terrible precision all the way back to Aeolus, back to the bronze wall and the floating island, back to the very door they had left 10 days before. Odysseus went up to Aeolus's house with one companion and a herald, found the family at dinner, and sat himself down on the threshold like a common beggar. The astonishment in the hall was total. How could he possibly be here again? What evil power had done this to him? And Odysseus told the plain truth, which for him is always worth noting. "My own cursed crew," he said, "and sleep ruined me. Set it right, my friends. You have the power." The silence that followed marked the true end of the voyage's luck. Aeolus rose and ordered him from the house, and the words he chose mattered a great deal more than the eviction itself. "Leave this island at once," he said, "most cursed of living men. It is against all law for me to shelter or help a man so plainly hated by the blessed gods. You come here as living proof of that hatred. Go." There it was, spoken aloud for the very first time, hated by the gods. Aeolus, a professional in matters of weather, had simply examined the evidence. A fair wind promised home, 9 days of guaranteed safety, and then a hurricane pouring out of a sealed bag within sight of the destination itself, and arrived at the only diagnosis available. This was no accident. This was policy. Somewhere in heaven, someone with the jurisdiction to do it had taken a personal dislike to this man, and no sensible host anywhere in the world ought to touch him now. The curse from that clifftop was beginning to show its teeth, not as drama, but as quiet, bureaucratic refusal. Doors would simply start closing now, everywhere, politely and for good. The Greeks trudged back to their ships and put out to sea with no wind to help them at all, since the master of every wind on earth had washed his hands of them completely. For 6 days and nights they rowed in silence, eating their hearts out, in the poem's own phrase, over what they themselves had done. No one was permitted to blame anyone. There was simply nothing left to say. The fires of Ithaca had already been visible once, and now there was only water and the sound of oars. On the 7th day, they raised a coastline. High cliffs wrapped around a harbour so sheltered and still, it seemed designed on purpose by some kindly providence. 11 ships rowed gratefully inside and tied up along its walls. Odysseus, for reasons he never fully explains, some instinct sharpened raw by the past year of loss, kept his own single ship outside the harbour's mouth and made it fast to a rock instead. That one decision was about to make him one of the loneliest commanders in the whole history of the sea. The harbour was called Telemachus, in the country of the Laestrygonians, and from a sailor's point of view, it looked perfect. Sheer cliffs wrapped it on every side, 2 headlands nearly touching at its mouth, and inside, no wave ever rose at all. 11 exhausted crews looked at that flat, windless water after 6 days at the oars, and did exactly what any tired sailor would do. They rowed in, moored close together in the calm, and rested. It seems not to have occurred to a single one of them to ask why so perfect a harbour stood entirely empty. No ships inside it, no town visible anywhere, only a thin thread of smoke rising somewhere further inland. Odysseus asked. He did not row in at all. He climbed a crag above his own moored ship to survey the country, saw nothing but that same distant smoke, and did what he had done on every strange coast since the Lotus-Eaters. He sent 3 men, 2 sailors and a herald, to learn who lived there and whether they ate bread. The scouts followed a wagon road inland and met at a spring outside the town a girl drawing water, a strapping girl, the poem calls her, the daughter of the local king, Antiphates. They asked her politely who ruled this land, and she pointed them toward her family's own house. Inside, they found a woman the size of a mountain peak, who called at once for her husband. The king came home from the assembly, and his notion of receiving foreign visitors was direct in the extreme. He snatched up one of the sailors and began preparing him for dinner. The other 2 scouts fled for their lives back down the wagon road, while behind them the king raised the alarm through the town, and the Laestrygonians came pouring out of their houses by the thousand, not men at all, but giants. The giants did not bother chasing the fleeing scouts. They did something far more efficient. They went straight to the cliffs. Understand the geometry of what happened next, because it turns that perfect harbour into a perfect trap. 11 ships lay moored side by side on still water, enclosed by high rock on every side, with a single narrow gate to the open sea. The Laestrygonians lined the cliff tops, ringing the whole basin, and began tearing boulders loose and dropping them straight down onto the packed ships below. There was no cover, no room to manoeuvre, no wind to sail by. Nothing at all beneath the falling stones but wooden hulls and human bodies. The poem compresses the massacre into only a few terrible lines. The crash of splintering hulls, the cries of dying men, the giants wading in afterward to spear the swimmers like fish and carry them off, plainly stated, for their own grim meal. Odysseus, outside the harbour mouth, could hear every bit of it and do nothing. Nothing. But one single thing. He drew his sword, cut the cable holding his own ship to its rock, shouted his crew to the oars, and they rowed for open water in terror of their lives, while the harbour behind them boiled. His ship, the one ship anchored outside, was the only one that escaped. The arithmetic of that single afternoon is worth sitting with quietly, since the poem itself does not dwell on it, and the speed of its telling can hide the true scale of the loss. 12 ships had sailed away from Troy. 11 of them, and every last man aboard, were destroyed inside that harbour within a single hour. Perhaps 500 men, comrades of 10 years of war and a year of wandering, gone between one meal and the next. The fleet of Ithaca now consisted of one single galley and some 45 souls. Everyone else who had sailed from home a decade earlier, the neighbours, the cousins, the boys who had grown into men on the beaches of Troy, ended their lives in the bellies of giants, in a nameless fjord beyond the edge of any known map. When the people of Ithaca, in later years, added up the true cost of Troy, this single hour was most of the total. Notice, too, since the poem quietly insists on it, exactly what saved that one remaining ship. Not strength, not divine favour, certainly not luck. A decision. Odysseus had looked at a perfect harbour and turned it down on no evidence whatsoever, purely because a year of catastrophe had already taught him that perfect things offered to exhausted men are usually bait. Call it paranoia if you like an ugly word for it. The poem would simply call it having learned. The captain who slept once within sight of Ithaca does not sleep here, and the entire difference between those two men is 11 ships. The lone ship fled on across empty water, and the poem gives its survivors the strangest, saddest breath of respite imaginable. Glad to have escaped death, it says, but grieving for their beloved companions. Glad and grieving in the very same breath, which may be the most honest sentence about survival ever written. In time they raised a low, wooded island and beached their ship along its shore, and for 2 full days and nights the survivors simply lay beside their vessel, consumed by exhaustion and grief, doing nothing at all, which, after the year they had just endured, may have been the wisest order Odysseus never had to give. On the 3rd day he took up spear and sword, climbed to a lookout point, and saw smoke rising from some house deep within the forest. He considered walking straight toward it, then decided to feed his men first, and Providence, for once, cooperated. A huge stag crossed his path on the way back down to the ship, and he killed it and carried it home across his own shoulders, so the crew could feast on the beach and finally sleep. At dawn he gathered them and told them the plain truth of their situation, which was that he did not know their situation at all. "Friends," he said, "we cannot tell east from west here, where the sun rises or where it sets. We have fallen off every chart that exists. There was smoke inland, and someone had made it, and the only way forward was to learn who." Hearing this, the men broke down and wept openly, and the poem tells us precisely why. They remembered the last 3 times someone had gone to investigate a plume of smoke: the Lotus-Eaters, the Cyclops, the Laestrygonians. In their own hard experience, smoke on the horizon meant that some of them were about to be eaten. This was not cowardice, it was simple pattern recognition. Odysseus, unmoved, did what any commander does with an unbearable decision. He randomized it. He split the survivors into 2 companies of 22 men each, one under his own command, the other under a big, brave, somewhat unsteady kinsman named Eurylochus. They shook lots in a bronze helmet, and the lot that leapt out belonged to Eurylochus. So Eurylochus and his 22 marched inland, weeping as they went, their comrades weeping in turn as they watched them vanish, and the forest closed behind them. Deep in a clearing they found a house of polished stone, and around it, wonder of wonders, proud mountain wolves and lions that made no move to attack, rising instead on their hind legs to fawn over the visitors like dogs greeting a master home from dinner, wagging and cringing in a way that somehow felt worse than any charge would have. From inside the house came the sound of a woman singing, a lovely voice, weaving steadily at a great loom. The men called out, and the doors opened on a gracious lady who invited them in to food and rest, and the whole company trooped happily inside, all but one. Eurylochus, sensing a trap at last, exactly one house too late in his life to be of any real use, stayed outside and watched through the door, and what he saw sent him running back through the forest to the ship, so shaken he could barely speak. The lady of that house was named Circe, and the men who had gone inside were, strictly speaking, no longer men at all. The island itself was called Aeaea, and its mistress was no ordinary woman. Circe was a goddess, a minor one by Olympian standards, but a genuine one, daughter of the sun god Helios himself, and aunt to the infamous Medea. She lived alone in her stone house among the trees, with her loom, her song, her tamed predators, and one particular hobby that Eurylochus had just watched in full operation through the doorway. She had welcomed the 22 sailors in, seated them, and served a dish of cheese, barley, honey, and wine, into which she had stirred a drug that made them forget their own native land entirely. Once they had eaten, she struck them each with her wand, and they became swine, bristles, snouts, bodies, voices, everything transformed except the one thing that truly mattered. Their minds remained fully human. She penned them in her sty, weeping pig's tears with a man's own understanding behind them, tossed them acorns, and returned calmly to her weaving. The wolves and lions in her yard, it was now painfully clear, had once been travellers too. Back at the beach, Eurylochus choked out what little he could of what he had seen, and begged Odysseus to launch the ship at once and abandon the transformed men while escape still remained possible. From a purely practical standpoint, it was sound advice. Odysseus refused it outright. He slung on his sword, took up his bow, and ordered Eurylochus to lead him back to the house, and when the man clung to his knees and would not go, Odysseus let him stay behind and went on alone. There was no plan at all in his head at this point, and the poem is honest enough to admit it. One man with a sword was about to visit a goddess who had already turned an entire company into livestock, and his whole strategy amounted to simply being angry about it. He was saved in the end by an intervention. On the forest path, a young man appeared, and it was the god Hermes in disguise, sent, we learn only later, at Athena's own quiet urging. Hermes told Odysseus plainly that he was walking straight toward his doom, then, being a practical sort of god, handed him the actual solution. He pulled from the earth a plant the gods called moly, black at the root with a flower white as milk, difficult for any mortal hand to dig up unaided, and gave it to Odysseus as an antidote. With moly already working in him, Circe's drug would simply fail to take hold, and Hermes scripted out exactly what must follow. When her wand falls and nothing happens, rush her with your sword drawn, as if to kill her outright. She will offer you her bed instead. Do not refuse a goddess, but make her swear first, on the great oath of the gods, to plot no further harm against you, or she will unman you all the same, even sworn. It unfolded exactly as scripted, which is one of the small pleasures of having a god write your evening for you. Circe served her drugged cup, and Odysseus drank it down without the slightest effect. Her wand fell, and instead of trotting obediently toward the sty, the stranger came at her with his sword raised. Circe shrieked, ducked beneath the blade, seized his knees, and asked the question that has echoed strangely down every telling since. "Who are you, that my drugs cannot touch?" "You must be Odysseus, the man of many turns. Hermes always told me he would come this way, home from Troy." It is a chilling little revelation, dropped almost in passing. The witch had known his itinerary in advance. His arrival on her island had, apparently, been scheduled somewhere well above the mortal world. She swore the oath he demanded, and he accepted what she offered, and her 4 handmaidens bathed the salt from his skin and laid out a feast, and Odysseus sat before the food and would not touch it. Circe asked why, and his answer is one of his finer moments. "How could any decent man eat or drink," he said, "while his companions were still trapped and unfree? Turn them back, and let me see them with my own eyes." So she went out to the sty with her wand, drove the pigs inside, and anointed each one with a second potion, and the bristles fell away, and they stood as men again, younger, taller, and better looking than before, the poem insists, and every one of them recognized Odysseus and wept, and even the goddess herself was moved by the sound of it. Then Circe did something no one expected. She invited the entire remaining crew. "Bring your ship ashore," she told him. "Store your gear in the caves, and bring the rest of your men to my house." So Odysseus went back for them, and talked down even Eurylochus, understandably resistant, having viewed that sty once already from the visitors' side, and the whole surviving company of Ithaca moved in with the very witch who had bewitched them. What followed is the strangest stretch of time in the whole Odyssey. They stayed a full year, not imprisoned, not enchanted, not, as far as the poem tells us, drugged in any way. They feasted daily on abundant meat and sweet wine inside the goddess's house, and the days folded quietly into seasons, and the seasons folded into a complete turning of the year, and nobody once spoke the word Ithaca. The men who had wept within sight of their own island's fires now sat by warm hearths, eating well, while the man who had once refused a magic fruit precisely because it caused forgetting, settled quietly into a goddess's bed and forgot on his own, with no lotus required at all. Comfort, it turns out, needs no pharmacology whatsoever. It ended the way these things so often end, with the followers gently nudging their leader. His men took him aside, and their words carry a careful, tender sound, the sound of people waking a sleepwalker. "Strange man," they said, "it is time to remember your own fatherland now, if it is truly fated that you should reach it at all." And Odysseus woke. That same evening he went to Circe, held her knees, and asked her to honour her old promise and send him home at last. She did not argue, did not weep, did not bargain, which sets her apart from nearly everyone else who ever hosted this man. But she told him something that dropped the floor entirely out from under the room. "You need not stay in my house against your will," she said, "but there is another journey you must make first. Before you can ever sail for home, you must sail instead to the house of Hades and dread Persephone, into the land of the dead itself, and consult the ghost of the blind prophet Tiresias of Thebes, who alone among the dead still keeps his understanding whole. He alone will tell you the way." Hearing this, Odysseus says his own heart broke inside him, and he sat down on the bed and wept, and wanted no more of life at all. And no one could reasonably blame him. No living man had ever made that particular voyage. To ask the way home and be told the route ran straight through death itself was surely the cruelest joke the cosmos had played on him yet. When he could finally speak again, he asked the same practical question he always asks. Who will pilot us there? No ship has ever sailed to Hades. And Circe gave him the eeriest answer of all. No pilot was needed whatsoever. Raise your mast, set your sail, and simply sit still. The north wind itself will carry you there. She laid out precise ritual instructions besides, the trench to be dug, the offerings to be poured, the black ram and black ewe soon to be sacrificed, all of which we will watch him carry out in the next part of this story. And in the morning, as the crew mustered to leave at last, the voyage claimed one more soul in the least dignified way imaginable. The youngest of the company, a sailor named Elpenor, no great fighter, the poem tells us, and not overburdened with brains either, had drunk heavily the night before, and gone up to sleep on the flat roof of Circe's house for the cool night air. Startled awake by the bustle of departure, he forgot entirely where he was, stepped straight off the roof instead of reaching for the ladder, and broke his neck on the ground below. In an epic otherwise populated by men killed by giants, gods, and monsters, Elpenor died of a hangover and bad architecture. The only casualty in the whole poem, for whom the fatal enemy was simply a staircase he failed to locate. His shipmates, hurrying for the beach, did not even pause to bury him. That single unfinished task was about to matter a great deal. The ship stood out from the shore with a fair wind Circe herself had sent behind it, and the crew learned only once they were well at sea exactly where that wind was carrying them. They wept, the poem says, and tore at their own hair. The bow pointed straight at the edge of the world and passed clean through it. Next stop, the country of the dead, the house of Hades. The ship ran the whole day before Circe's wind, and at sunset reached the very limit of the world, the deep, endless river of ocean that the Greeks believed circled every land there was. Beyond it lay the country of the Cimmerians, a people wrapped forever in mist and cloud, on whom the sun never once looks down, and past their fog-bound shore, the entrance to the world below. It is a geography of pure dread, and the poem paints it in grey upon grey. No monster guards this particular border. The border is simply the end of light itself. They beached the ship and carried the offerings Circe had provided to the exact place she had described, where two roaring rivers of the underworld meet beside a single rock. There, Odysseus dug a trench with his own sword, a cubit long and a cubit wide, and poured around it the triple libation ode to all the dead, first honey mixed with milk, then sweet wine, then plain water, scattering white barley over the whole, offering his prayers and promises to the strengthless dead below. Then he cut the throats of a black ram and a black ewe over the trench, and the dark blood ran down into it, and the dead came. They rose up out of the gloom of Erebus in crowds, drawn by the scent of blood, and the poem's own inventory of them still chills. Brides who died young, boys and old men worn thin by long grief, girls with fresh sorrow still in their hearts, and whole ranks of warriors killed in battle, still wearing their blood-stained armour, drifting around the trench from every side, with a sound the poem compares to a vast, inhuman crying. Pale fear took hold of Odysseus. His task now, and it was a horrible one, was to stand guard over that blood. Circe had told him that any ghost who drank from the trench would regain, briefly, both memory and speech, and that he must hold his drawn sword above it and let none of them drink before Tiresias, the one soul he had actually come for. So he crouched there in the dark, at the very edge of the world, a sword held over a puddle of blood, rationing brief moments of remembered life out to the crowding dead. The first ghost to approach was not one he expected at all. It was Elpenor, the young sailor who had walked off Circe's roof only the previous morning, already arrived in Hades ahead of the ship, since a ghost travels rather faster than any galley. Needing no blood to speak, being so newly dead, he asked for the only thing the dead can ever ask for. "Do not sail away and leave my body unwept and unburied back at Circe's house," he begged, "or the god's anger will fall on you. Burn me with my armour, raise a mound for me by the grey sea, and plant on it the oar I pulled in life beside my own companions." Odysseus promised him everything, and kept every word of that promise, and so the least of his men received one of this whole epic's most quietly touching funeral requests. Then, before the prophet himself arrived, came a ghost that very nearly broke him. His own mother, Anticlea, had still been alive when he sailed for Troy. She sat now among the shadows across the trench, and he could not let her drink. Not yet, not before Tiresias, and so he had to hold his sword between himself and his own mother while she waited there, silent and unknowing who he was. At the edge of that blood, he tells us plainly, he wept. It is difficult to imagine the discipline such a moment demanded, and the poem refuses to let us look away from it. Tiresias came at last, the blind seer of Thebes, carrying his golden staff, the one soul in all of Hades permitted to keep his understanding intact. He drank, and then he told Odysseus everything, and it is worth setting down plainly here, since it becomes the roadmap for the remainder of this whole story, and beyond it. "Poseidon hates you," he said, "for the blinding of his son, and will make your road home bitter, yet you may still come home, late and hard, if you can hold to just one thing, restraint. You will reach the island of Thrinacia, where the sun god keeps his cattle, leave them entirely unharmed, and all of you may yet reach Ithaca. Harm them, and I foresee ruin for both your ship and your crew, and if you yourself somehow escape even that, you will come home late, broken, aboard a stranger's ship, having lost every companion, only to find trouble waiting in your own house, arrogant men devouring your goods and courting your wife. You will pay them back in blood." The prophecy repeats Polyphemus's own curse almost word for word, and that repetition is the entire point. The curse has been ratified now. It is simply the future. And then Tiresias went further still, past the story we are telling tonight, into territory the Odyssey itself never actually reaches. "After the reckoning in your hall," he said, "you must take up a well-shaped oar and walk inland, away from the sea entirely, until you meet a people who know nothing at all of ships or salt water, where a stranger will look at the thing on your shoulder and call it a winnowing fan for grain. There, plant the oar in the earth, make sacrifice to Poseidon, and go home at last. Death will come to you," he said gently, "from the sea or away from it." A phrase so ambiguous it has been argued over for centuries, describing perhaps a peaceful death in sleek old age, surrounded by a prosperous people. It is a strange and beautiful ending, left hanging just beyond this poem's own horizon. The old sailor walking until the sea itself is forgotten, making his final peace with the god who tormented him the longest. The prophet's errand was done, and now Odysseus let his mother drink. Recognition came into her eyes at last, and she asked how a living man had ever found his way down to that place. And then he asked her the question he had been most afraid to ask, and she answered it without flinching. "Your father lives," she told him, "but in misery, out on the farm, sleeping in ashes by the fire through winter, and on fallen leaves in the vineyard through summer, grieving for you every single day. Your son still holds your lands. Your wife remains inside your own halls, faithful, and her nights are one long, unbroken weeping. And I," she said, "did not die of any sickness at all. I died simply of longing for you, my shining one. It was missing you that drained the honey out of my own life." 3 times he reached out to hold her. 3 times she slipped through his arms like a shadow or a dream. When he cried out at the cruelty of it, she explained gently that this is simply what the dead are now. The sinews no longer hold flesh or bone together. The spirit merely flies off like a dream once the fire has taken the body. It is the tenderest and the bleakest scene in this whole epic, and nearly every literature since has quietly borrowed it. After her came a procession, famous women of the old stories, sent up by Persephone herself, queens and mothers of heroes, each one drinking in turn and telling her own tale. Then came the men of Troy, and each reunion turned the same knife a little deeper. Agamemnon arrived weeping and told Odysseus exactly what had been waiting for him at home: the bath, the butchery, his own wife's hand behind the blade, and offered him bitter advice in return. "Trust no woman completely," he warned, "and come into your own harbour secretly rather than openly. Though your Penelope," he added, almost grudgingly, "is not that kind of woman." Achilles came next, greatest of them all, and Odysseus tried, clumsily, to offer him some comfort. "Do not grieve at death," he said. "We honoured you like a god while you lived, and now you rule among the dead in turn." What Achilles said in reply is one of the most famous speeches in Greek literature, and it quietly detonates the entire value system he had died defending. "Do not speak sweetly of death to me, shining Odysseus. I would rather be the hired hand of some poor, landless farmer, alive above the earth, than rule as king over the whole of the perished dead." The man who had chosen a short, glorious life over a long, forgotten one had now seen exactly what that bargain cost, and clearly wanted his money back. He brightened only once, when Odysseus told him his son Neoptolemus had fought bravely at Troy, and the great ghost strode off across the fields of asphodel, rejoicing quietly in his boy. One ghost refused to come at all. Great Ajax stood apart in silence, still furious over the armour of Achilles, awarded to Odysseus, that had driven him to his own sword. Odysseus called out to him with real remorse, wishing aloud he had never won that prize, begging him to speak. Ajax turned without a single word and walked away into the dark. In a poem built almost entirely from speeches, it remains the most devastating exit anyone makes in it, an anger death itself could not soften. Deeper still, Odysseus glimpsed the old machinery of the afterlife at work. Minos judging the dead with his golden sceptre, Tantalus standing in his pool, water at his very chin, and fruit just above his head, flinching forever away from both his thirst and his hunger. Sisyphus, heaving his boulder up the long slope, only to watch it roll shamelessly back down again. And the shade of Heracles, gloomy even in his own glory, who recognized in Odysseus a fellow sufferer of impossible labours. Then the nations of the dead began pressing toward the blood in numbers past counting, their crying rising to something enormous, and even Odysseus's nerve finally reached its limit. Pale terror took hold of him, a fear that Persephone might send the Gorgon's own head up out of the darkness, and he ran for the ship, and the crew bent to the oars, and the current of ocean, and then a rising wind, carried the living back out of the country of the dead. He had gone down there for directions. He came back up with something else entirely, something every listener of this poem receives right alongside him. He had seen, in plain terms, exactly what everything costs. Glory from the mouth of Achilles, homecoming from the mouth of Agamemnon, waiting from the mouth of his own mother. Everything he endures for the rest of this voyage is now endured by a man who has already read the full price list. The ship ran east over grey water, back toward the sun, back toward Circe's island, where a promise made to a dead sailor and one waiting oar still needed keeping. They reached Aeaea in darkness and slept on the shore, and at dawn they kept that promise. They cut Elpenor's body down, burned it with his armour, raised a mound over the ashes by the grey sea, and planted his oar on top of it, exactly as his ghost had asked. Circe came down to meet them with bread, meat and wine, greeting them with a line that manages to be both warm and faintly unnerving at once. "Reckless men," she said, "who went down alive into the house of Hades. You will be twice dead when everyone else only dies once." That night, while the crew slept, she drew Odysseus aside, and what she gave him was something no one else on this entire voyage had ever offered him: a briefing. Item by item, she laid out every danger still waiting on the road ahead, what it looked like, how it worked, and exactly what to do about it. The Sirens first, then a choice between two dreadful sea passages, and past them, at last, the island of the sun. She even told him plainly where his own judgment would fail him, and what to do about that failure in advance. It is worth pausing to notice what this relationship had become. The witch, who had turned his men into swine, was now the single most useful ally Odysseus possessed anywhere on his journey. He had arrived on her island carrying only a sword, and he left it carrying a full intelligence report. At dawn they sailed, and the first test arrived almost immediately. The wind died to a flat, glassy calm, exactly as Circe had warned it would, because the Sirens make their own weather. The Sirens themselves turned out to be two creatures perched on a flowering meadow, and their only weapon was a song. Any sailor who once heard it turned his ship toward the sound and was lost, and scattered across their meadow lay the proof of it, a heap of rotting men, the skin drawn tight and shrivelling on their bones. What the song offered was never simple pleasure. Circe and the Sirens themselves were both quite precise about that. They sang knowledge. As Odysseus's own ship drew near, they called out to him by his very name, promising they knew everything that had happened at Troy, and everything still to come across the whole fruitful earth, if only he would come nearer and sail on wiser for it. It was, in essence, a library that ate people, and for a man of his particular hunger for knowing things, it was the single most personally aimed trap on the entire route. The defence Circe had prescribed has since become one of the most enduring images in the world. Odysseus took a wheel of beeswax, cut it into pieces, and worked it soft in the sun, then pressed it into the ears of every rower until they could hear nothing at all. Then, because Circe had told him he alone might listen safely if he wished, and because he was Odysseus, and of course he wished, he had his men bind him upright to the mast by wrist and ankle, and gave them a single standing order in advance. "If I beg you to release me," he told them, "bind me tighter still." Then they rowed into the calm. The song came drifting across the water, and it worked exactly as advertised, even on a man who had been fully warned in advance. Odysseus strained against his ropes and signalled desperately with his eyes for release, ordered it, begged for it outright, and the system he had built against his own future self held perfectly firm. Two of the crew, Perimedes and Eurylochus, rose and bound him tighter still, exactly as instructed, and the ship sailed on until the song faded behind them, and the wax came out, and the ropes came off. He remains the only man in the whole of mythology said to have heard the Sirens and lived to describe it, and he managed it through a strikingly modern piece of reasoning, a binding decision made while sane about exactly what he would be permitted to do once tempted. Philosophers and economists still call this kind of arrangement a Ulysses contract, borrowing his old Latin name, and the same basic device is used today in medicine and law, several thousand years after a fictional sailor first invented it out of rope and beeswax. Beyond the Sirens, the sea itself began to smoke and thunder ahead of them, and the crew, hearing it, dropped their oars entirely in terror. Odysseus walked the length of the deck, talking them back to their benches. "We have faced worse than this," he told them. "It is nothing more terrible than the Cyclops' cave." It was a carefully chosen truth, not quite the whole one. What he did not tell them, and admits to us plainly himself, was everything Circe had actually said about the passage ahead, because there was nothing whatsoever the crew could do about it, and a rowing man cannot row and despair in the same breath. The passage was a narrow strait, which tradition has long placed quite plausibly at the turbulent Strait of Messina between Italy and Sicily. On one side stood a low rock crowned with a great fig tree, and beneath it, 3 times each day, a whirlpool called Charybdis swallowed the sea whole, and 3 times each day vomited it back out again, and any ship caught in the swallowing went down with the water and never surfaced. No skill of any sailor could help against her. She was simply a mouth set into the ocean. On the other side rose a sheer cliff, its peak lost permanently in cloud, and halfway up its face, a cave. In that cave lived Scylla. The poem builds her carefully, piece by piece. 12 dangling legs, 6 necks of enormous length, each ending in a head lined with 3 rows of packed teeth, and, in a detail that somehow makes the whole creature worse rather than better, a strange, high yelp like a newborn puppy. She could not be fought, could not be dodged, could not be outrun. Her method never varied. From every ship that passed within her reach, each of her 6 heads took exactly 1 man. Here stood the choice Circe had already laid out for him, the coldest piece of arithmetic in ancient literature. Steer wide of Scylla and toward Charybdis, and risk the whirlpool taking the entire ship and every soul aboard it. Or hug Scylla's cliff instead and lose 6 men. Not perhaps 6, 6 guaranteed. Odysseus had asked Circe, back when she briefed him, whether he might simply fight Scylla off and lose no one at all. And her answer compressed the whole lesson of his life into a single sentence. "Stubborn man," she said, "always thinking of war and battle. Will you not yield even to the immortals? She is not mortal. She is undying evil itself. There is no defense against her. The only course is flight, and the only real question left is the size of what you lose. Row hard," she told him, "and while you row, call out to her mother, and it may keep her from striking a second time." So he chose, as every captain in his position eventually must, and he chose the 6. He put on his armour anyway, uselessly, and stood in the bow with 2 spears, scanning the cliff, unable, even now, to be the kind of man who simply does not try. The ship entered the strait, hugging the rock, every eye aboard fixed in horror on the far side, where Charybdis stood in full swallow, the sea roaring down her throat, spray raining across the mast, the exposed sea floor showing black at the vortex's own heart. And while every man watched that whirlpool, Scylla took her toll from behind them. 6 heads came down, and 6 men went up. Odysseus turned at their cry and saw them lifted high above the deck, writhing, calling his name, stretching their hands down toward him. And there was nothing left to be done but row. She devoured them at the very mouth of her cave, he tells us, still reaching for him, still calling out. Of everything he suffered across every sea of this voyage, he says that was the single most pitiful sight his own eyes ever had to witness. It is the one loss of this whole journey that he chose in advance, with full knowledge, as the fixed price of saving everyone else. You can hear, in the very telling of it, that the trade never once stopped costing him. The ship shot clear of the strait into open water, 39 men remaining where 45 had stood only hours before, and ahead, low and green on the horizon, an island rose into view. Across the water came the distant lowing of cattle, beautiful, broad-browed animals in vast herds, a sound that carried with it all the comfort of home, of pasture, of ordinary settled life. Every man aboard had already been warned about that island twice, once by a prophet in the Underworld, and once by a goddess on her own beach, and the 2 warnings agreed exactly with one another. The crew, meanwhile, was starving. The cattle were fat. 2 warnings and 1 very old hunger were about to have it out between them. This was Thrinacia, and its herds belonged to Helios, the sun god who sees everything that happens beneath him, watching being, quite literally, his job. 7 herds of cattle and 7 flocks of sheep grazed there, 50 head in each, numbers that never grew and never shrank, tended by 2 nymphs who were his own daughters. Immortal livestock, sacred, precisely inventoried, and kept under a kind of permanent aerial surveillance. There has perhaps never been a worse possible place in all of world literature to steal a single cow. Odysseus did not want to land there at all. Standing off the coast, he repeated to his crew exactly what both Tiresias and Circe had told him, that this island held the single most dangerous temptation of the whole voyage, and gave the order to row straight past it. For the first time in the entire journey, the crew formally refused. Their spokesman was Eurylochus, second in command, and his speech is mutiny conducted entirely in the calm language of good sense. "You are made of iron," he told Odysseus, "never tired, while we are exhausted men who have not slept properly in days. Night is coming, and night winds wreck ships, and you would have us row on into darkness, past a perfectly safe beach. Let us land, cook supper, sleep beside the ship, and sail on again at first light." The whole crew shouted their agreement, and Odysseus understood, even as he gave way, that some god was already at work arranging ruin, because he had lost the argument before it had even properly begun. He salvaged the one concession still available to him. Every man swore a solemn oath on the spot. They would touch nothing on the island. Not one cow, not one sheep. They would eat only what remained of Circe's own provisions and sail again at first light. That night, while they slept on the sand, Zeus sent the storm. It blew hard from the south through the whole night, and then it simply did not stop. For a full month, 30 days without a break, the south wind and the east wind traded off, sealing that island shut. and no ship of that age could beat its way out against them. The Greeks sat trapped on Thrinacia, while Circe's provisions dwindled day by day to crumbs, and then to nothing at all. The men scattered along the shore with hooks and snares, catching whatever fish and birds they could manage, and hunger of the genuine kind, the sort that hollows a face and gradually unhinges good judgment, settled into the camp and quietly took its seat beside the oaths they had all sworn. And all around them, morning and evening, the fat, glossy, absolutely forbidden cattle went on grazing within an easy spear's throw, uncountable meals standing on the hoof, guarded by nothing at all but a promise. Notice how carefully this trap was built, because it was built deliberately. Tiresias had said, "If you harm the cattle." A warning of that particular kind does not simply sit and wait to see what happens next. The month of contrary wind is precisely the mechanism by which that "if" quietly becomes the outcome. The gods in this poem rarely force a man's hand directly. They arrange the circumstances in which a man's own nature will do the forcing for them, and then they simply wait. The same crew that had opened a certain leather bag out of hungry envy was now being starved, methodically, beside an all-you-can-eat sacrilege. Odysseus held them for the entire month, which may be the single most underrated feat of leadership in the whole epic. Then, he made the one mistake still waiting for him. He walked inland alone, to a sheltered spot out of the wind, to pray to the gods for some way off the island. The gods answered that particular prayer with their own dark sense of humour. They poured sleep over his eyes. The one man whose stubborn wakefulness had held this whole crew in line was switched off, gently, at the exact decisive moment, precisely as he had been once before, within sight of Ithaca's own fires. If you have ever wondered whether the gods of this story play entirely fair, that answer settles it. Back on the beach, Eurylochus saw his chance and delivered the speech of his life to the starving men around him. "Every death is hateful," he said, "but death by starvation is the most miserable of them all. Let us drive off the finest of these cattle and sacrifice them properly to the gods, with full rites, and vow that once we reach Ithaca, we will build Helios a splendid temple in repayment. And if the sun god is angry enough to sink our ship for it, well, I would rather swallow the sea and die in one single moment than waste away by inches on some empty island." It is, in fairness, a genuinely persuasive speech. It offers piety, restitution, and a clear preference for a quick death over a slow one. And every starving man on that beach voted yes with his own 2 feet. They cut out the finest of the sun god's own cattle and killed them. What follows is a sacrifice gone wrong in every physical detail, ritual turned nightmare. They had no barley for the sprinkling, so they used oak leaves instead. No wine for the libation, so they poured water. The proper forms of worship, performed with entirely the wrong materials, offered over stolen goods, in a desperate attempt to buy pardon for the very theft still in progress. And then the world itself seemed to object. The flayed hides crawled along the ground of their own accord. The meat, on the spits and still raw alike, lowed and bellowed with the actual voices of cattle. The men ate anyway. They feasted on that bellowing meat for 6 full days, which may be the most quietly horrifying single sentence in the entire poem. Hunger alone can make men do what the gods have expressly forbidden. It takes something darker still to go back for a second helping, while your own dinner is audibly complaining. Odysseus woke at last, smelled the roasting fat carried on the wind, and knew everything, in full, before he had even reached the beach. His cry to the gods came out like the voice of a man reaching the very end of a long rope. "You lulled me to sleep to ruin me," he said. And high on Olympus the accounting was already underway. The nymph herdmaids had run straight to their father, and Helios stood before Zeus with an ultimatum that shows exactly how much leverage the sun itself carries in that universe. "Punish the men who killed my cattle," he demanded, "or I will go down and shine among the dead instead, and light the underworld in place of the sky above." A solar strike. Zeus, facing the very real prospect of the sun abandoning the heavens over what amounted to an insurance dispute, gave his word at once. "Sail on, old friend," he answered. "I will handle the ship myself." On the seventh day the wind finally dropped, and the Greeks launched at once and stood out to sea, and for a little while the island sank astern, and something almost like hope crept back aboard. Then, once they were out of sight of every last scrap of land, with nothing around them but sky and open water, Zeus set a blue-black cloud directly over the ship, and the sea itself darkened beneath it. The end arrived with a terrible efficiency. A screaming squall out of the west snapped both forestays at once, and the mast toppled backward, its rigging crashing down into the bilge, and the falling spar struck the helmsman across the skull and dropped him dead over the side. Then Zeus threw his thunderbolt. It struck the ship amidships, spun the hull, and filled it with the reek of sulphur, and every man aboard went into the sea together. The poem gives us the crew's final image itself, bobbing around the blackened hull like seabirds on the waves, the god quietly taking their homecoming from them, until, one by one, the water simply collected them. Every prophecy, every warning, every broken oath, all of it arrived here. Of the roughly 600 men who had sailed from Troy, the count of the living now stood at exactly one. Odysseus survived on nothing but a shipwright's instinct. He lashed the floating mast and keel together with a leather backstay and rode the wreckage like a makeshift raft. And then the wind swung around to the south and delivered the cruelest part of the joke. It blew him backward all night, straight toward the strait, straight toward Charybdis, and he arrived precisely as she began her morning swallow. The whirlpool took his raft down whole. Odysseus leapt clear, caught the branches of the great fig tree overhanging the vortex, and hung there, clinging, he says, like a bat, with nothing beneath his feet but the spinning throat of the sea, and waited out the long hours until Charybdis finally vomited the water back. His timbers shot up out of the depths at last, and he dropped, struck the water beside them, hauled himself aboard, and paddled clear of the strait with his own 2 hands. Scylla, on her cliff above, never once saw him. A god, he says simply, hid him from her sight. Even Poseidon's curse, it seems, honoured its own fine print. He had to live. For 9 days he drifted across an empty sea on his lashed-together spars. On the 10th night, the gods carried him ashore on a wooded island said to sit at the very navel of the ocean, home to a goddess who lived there entirely alone, and who would look upon the half-drowned, salt-crusted, sole survivor washed up on her beach and decide, with the whole undivided heart of an immortal, that she intended to keep him. The island was Ogygia. We have stood here once already, in the very first minutes of tonight's story. The wandering for now is over. The waiting is only just beginning. 7 years with Calypso. Ogygia was, by every account, a paradise. A cave hung with vines heavy with grapes, meadows thick with violets and wild parsley, 4 clear springs running off in 4 separate directions, alders and poplars and sweet-smelling cypress full of nesting birds. Even a god arriving there, the poem tells us, would stop and stare in simple wonder. And in time, one eventually does exactly that. Its only inhabitant was Calypso, a goddess, daughter of the Titan Atlas, living in a kind of exile at the far edge of the sea, alone with her loom and her garden. Her very name comes from a Greek word meaning to hide or to conceal, and that is precisely what she did with the man the sea delivered to her doorstep. For 7 years, as far as the entire rest of the world knew, Odysseus had simply ceased to exist. Understand exactly what she offered him, because it is the largest offer any mortal in the whole of Greek myth ever receives. Not merely her bed, and not merely her island. Immortality. She would make him ageless and deathless, her husband forever, in a garden at the very end of the world. Every terror of the human condition cancelled at a stroke. The fate that had claimed Achilles waived. The old age waiting patiently for him back home waived as well. All he had to do was stop wanting Ithaca. And here is the extraordinary thing, the thing that quietly makes Odysseus who he is. He said no. Not once, in some single grand dramatic scene, but continuously, quietly, for 7 straight years, in the only way available to a mortal man with no ship at all, which was simply to remain in grief. His nights, the poem tells us, with its usual honesty, Odysseus spent in the goddess's own bed, unwilling beside the willing, since she was a goddess, and he was, in the plainest terms, both her guest and her prisoner at once. And the poem never once pretends that a captive man's choices are clean. But his days he spent alone out on the headland, sitting on the bare rocks, looking east across the water, and weeping. 7 years of that. The man of many devices, the great escape artist of his age, entirely out of devices, left with nothing of his old cleverness but the plain refusal to be consoled. It is worth pausing on that choice itself, because the poem clearly wants us to. When it finally comes to a head, Calypso lays the comparison before him directly, without any malice in it at all. "I tell you truly," she says, "that if you knew the sufferings still waiting for you between here and your own homeland, you would stay here with me and be immortal. And besides," she adds, with an immortal's own plain frankness, "I am surely no less fine than your wife, in form or in stature. Mortal women cannot rightly compete with goddesses in beauty." Every word of it happens to be true. And Odysseus's answer to her is the hinge on which this entire epic turns. "Goddess," he says, "I know it. All of it is exactly as you say. Wise Penelope falls far short of you to look upon," he told her, "for she is mortal, and you are deathless and unaging. But even so, what I want, every single day, is simply to go home and to see the day of my return. And if some god wrecks me again on the wine-dark sea, I will bear that too. I have already suffered so much. Let this be added to the rest." Read that answer again, slowly, because it stands as one of the great statements of what it means to be human, ever set down on a page. He does not pretend the island is anything less than beautiful, or the goddess anything less than superior, or the open sea anything less than dangerous. He concedes every single point she makes, and chooses Ithaca regardless. A mortal wife over an immortal lover. An old age over an eternal youth. A difficult real life over a perfect suspended one. The lotus, back many nights ago now, had erased the desire for home from the outside, chemically, in a single afternoon. Calypso's offer tests something far harder, whether that same desire can be dissolved instead from the inside, given 7 full years of paradise to work on it. It cannot. Scholars sometimes say the entire Odyssey is contained inside this one scene, and they are not far wrong. It is, at its core, the story of a man offered literally everything, who asked instead, patiently, for his own difficult life back. The rescue, when it finally arrived, began far away, in something very like a committee meeting. On Olympus, with Poseidon conveniently absent, feasting among the Ethiopians at the edge of the world, Athena raised the case of Odysseus before Zeus and the assembled gods. Her speech is a small masterpiece of targeted indignation. "What is the point," she asked, "of any king ruling gently and justly, if this is the reward it earns him? Odysseus sits rotting on an island, held by a nymph, weeping for a home he cannot reach, and now his own son stands in danger too, since the suitors back on Ithaca are quietly plotting to murder the boy. Zeus, gently prompted, agreed the time had come at last, and the machinery of fate finally began to turn. Hermes the messenger was sent skimming across the waves like a seabird, carrying to Calypso the decision of the management above her. The scene between those two immortals is one of the finest in the whole poem. Hermes arrived at the lovely cave and found the goddess weaving and singing, cedar and juniper burning fragrant on her hearth, and Odysseus, exactly as ever, out on the shore, crying. Over refreshments, since even a divine ultimatum observes proper hospitality, Hermes delivered his message plainly. Zeus says the man must go. It is not fated that he die here. His destiny is to see his own people and his own home again. Calypso's reply, before she finally yielded, is the closest thing anywhere in Homer to a protest against double standards, lodged on Olympus some 2,700 years early. "You gods are jealous," she said, "and merciless. You male gods take mortal women exactly whenever you please, yet let a goddess love a mortal man, and you begrudge her every single time." And she listed the precedents like a practiced advocate, other goddesses whose mortal lovers the gods had struck down for exactly this offence. "And now," she said, "you envy me, my man, the one I saved myself, riding his own broken keel alone across the sea, after Zeus had personally smashed his ship to pieces. Very well, let him go if Zeus commands it. But I cannot send him myself. I have no ships of my own, and no crews to man them. I can only give him advice, and hide nothing from him." She kept that word with a grace that redeems her entire strange captaincy of that island. She found Odysseus on the shore and told him to grieve no longer, that she was sending him home at last. His first reaction was entirely, recognizably himself. He did not believe her. He refused to set foot on any raft until she swore the great oath of the gods that this was not simply some new trick against him. And Calypso only smiled, stroked his cheek, called him incorrigible, and swore it by the river Styx, the one oath no god can ever break. That evening they dined together a final time, she on ambrosia, he on ordinary mortal food. And she made him one last offer of immortality, and heard, once more, his final answer, and let the matter rest there for good. For 4 days after that, the goddess and the man built a boat together. She gave him a great bronze axe and an adze, and led him to the tallest trees on her island, alder and poplar and fir, long dead and dry, the very best wood for floating. He felled 20 of them himself, trimmed and smoothed, and joined them with pegs and mortises, decked the craft, stepped a mast, hung a steering oar, and fenced its sides with willow against the waves. Calypso brought cloth for the sail, and stocked the finished boat with water, wine, grain, and cooked meats. The poem, whose original audience knew boats the way we know cars today, lingers lovingly over every joint and plank of this one. And that lingering matters. This final ship of Odysseus's was never simply handed to him. He built it with his own 2 hands, plank by plank, a king turned carpenter to earn his own way back into the world. On the 5th day she bathed him, dressed him in fragrant clothes, sent a warm and steady wind out behind him, and stood alone on the shore of her hidden island, watching the little raft dwindle slowly to nothing on the horizon. She had loved him for 7 years, and released him inside 4 days. Of every being who ever held Odysseus against his will across this whole story, she is the only one the poem allows a broken heart. Odysseus sailed on alone for 17 days and nights, never once sleeping, steering by the very stars she had named for him, keeping the Great Bear always on his left hand, exactly as instructed. On the 18th day, A coastline finally rose ahead of him like a shield laid flat on a misty sea. The land of the Phaeacians, his last stop before home, though he did not yet know that. And at that exact moment, returning at last from Ethiopia, Poseidon looked down from a distant mountain range and saw, sailing calmly across his own sea, the one mortal he hated above all others in the world. His reaction was a growl of pure, wounded grievance. So the other gods changed their minds about Odysseus while I was away at dinner. Very well. He is fated to reach the Phaeacians, and that much I cannot prevent. But I can still give him his fill of trouble first. And the god of the sea picked up his trident and set to work on the weather in person. What he raised over that small raft was every storm at once. East wind, south wind, west wind, and north wind together, driving the sea into chaos from every quarter simultaneously. Odysseus's knees went loose beneath him, and he spoke aloud the same wish shipwrecked men have spoken ever since, that he had simply died at Troy, on solid ground, with an army gathered around him and a proper funeral to follow, rather than out here alone, waiting to become a fish's dinner. A wave tore the steering oar clean out of his hands, snapped the mast, and blew him bodily off the raft, and his own heavy sea clothes dragged him far under the surface before he fought his way back up, spitting brine, and hauled himself onto the disintegrating platform of logs. His rescue, when it came, arrived from an entirely unexpected corner of the sea. A white seabird settled on the wreck, and it was Ino, once a mortal woman herself, now a minor goddess of the waves, and she took pity on him. Her advice was drastic. "The raft is finished," she told him. "Strip off those clothes, take my veil, wind it around your chest, and swim. It cannot let you drown, and once you reach land, throw it back into the sea and look away as you do." Odysseus, being Odysseus, suspected a trap even in the middle of catastrophe, and decided to stay with the raft as long as two of its planks still held together, which, shortly, they did not. A wave the size of a hillside blew the timbers apart like chaff. He mounted a single beam like a horse, stripped, bound the veil around his chest, and went into the sea. He swam for 2 full days and nights through the swell, kept alive by the veil and by Athena, who quietly flattened the worst of the wind and set a steady push behind him from the north. When he finally raised the coastline, it very nearly killed him after everything else. There was no harbour anywhere, only reefs and cliffs, with the sea exploding white against them. And his first attempt to land ended with a wave hurling him straight onto a rock face, where he clung with torn hands until the backwash ripped him loose again, leaving skin on the stone the way an octopus leaves pebbles stuck to its own suckers when pulled from its hole. That is the poem's own image, not a borrowed one, and it has been making listeners wince for 2,700 years. Swimming along outside the surf, he found at last the mouth of a river and prayed to its god, and the river stilled its current and let him crawl ashore. What came out of that water was a king of nothing at all, naked, swollen with brine, seawater running from his mouth and nose, without ship, crew, clothing, or a single possession left to his name. The sea had stripped him of everything he owned except his own life and his own mind. He kissed the earth, threw Ino's veil back into the waves exactly as promised, and then solved his last problem of that endless day like the survivor he had become. Night was coming, and a naked, exhausted man dies quickly of exposure beside a cold river. He found 2 olive bushes grown into a single thicket, one wild and one cultivated, a small detail the poem clearly loves, burrowed into the deep drift of dead leaves beneath them, and buried himself there like a live coal banked carefully in ashes on some lonely farm. Athena poured sleep over his eyes. He had arrived, though he did not yet know it, at the final strange country of the whole voyage. It was Scheria, land of the Phaeacians, and it offered something entirely new after everything that had come before. Not monsters, not witches, not cannibals, but a civilized, wealthy, faintly self-satisfied seafaring people, beloved of the gods, whose ships were the marvel of the whole world, needing no steersman at all, finding any harbour on earth by thought alone. Their king was Alcinous, and their queen Arete was honoured as wisely as any man in the kingdom, and their capital held harbours, temples, an open assembly place, and gardens that bore fruit through every season of the year without pause. After 10 years spent among the impossible, Odysseus had finally washed up in front of something merely wonderful: a functioning society. His introduction to it came, fittingly, through a teenager doing the laundry. The Princess Nausicaa, prompted by a dream Athena had sent her, had driven the palace washing down to the river that morning with her maids, and once the work was done, they bathed and played at ball along the beach, and a stray throw into the water raised a shout that woke the sleeping man beneath the olive trees. What followed is one of Greek epic's finest small comedies of manners. Odysseus emerged from the bushes naked as a lion, salt-crusted and thoroughly alarming, holding a leafy branch in front of himself for the sake of decency, and every girl on that beach scattered screaming, except one. Nausicaa stood her ground, and the shipwrecked diplomat facing her produced, on no sleep and an empty stomach, one of the finest speeches of his entire life, opening with the unimprovable line, "Are you a goddess or a mortal woman?" He compared her to Artemis, blessed her future husband in advance, and asked, simply, for a rag to cover himself and directions into town, all while maintaining a careful, respectful distance, which, under the circumstances, may have been the single most persuasive part of the whole speech. It worked, as his speeches so often did. Bathed, oiled, and dressed in clothing from the royal laundry, made taller and more striking still by Athena for good measure, he impressed the princess enough that she remarked wistfully to her maids that she rather wished her own future husband might be a man very much like him. She gave him shrewd, practical advice in return. Enter the city on his own, to avoid gossip, walk straight past the king, and clasp the knees of Queen Arete instead, since her favour decided nearly everything in that particular household. He did exactly as told, walking into the torchlit hall, wrapped in a mist Athena had drawn around him, and appeared, to the astonishment of the entire court, kneeling suddenly at the queen's own feet. The Phaeacians received their nameless stranger with textbook hospitality. Food first, questions later. And there Odysseus stayed for days, a guest of honour with no name at all, while the court entertained him properly. Here Homer builds one of his most cunning scenes. The blind court bard Demodocus sang for the assembled company, and what he chose to sing, with every story in the world available to him, was the Trojan War, the quarrel between Odysseus and Achilles, the famous names his listeners already knew by heart. The anonymous guest at that feast pulled his own cloak over his head and wept into it secretly at hearing his own life performed as entertainment. It happened twice. The second time, the bard sang the story of the wooden horse itself, and Odysseus dissolved entirely, weeping, Homer tells us, the way a woman weeps over the body of her husband, killed defending his own city. Which is to say, the poem quietly compares the sacker of Troy to Troy's own grieving widows, and simply lets that comparison sit there, unexplained, for good. King Alcinous saw the weeping, stopped the music, and finally asked the question that had been politely postponed for days. "Stranger, who are you?" And with that, the mask came off at last. "I am Odysseus, son of Laertes," he said, "known to all men for my schemes. My fame reaches heaven, and my home is Ithaca." Then, across 4 full books of the poem, he told them everything. The Cicones, the Lotus, the Cyclops, the winds, the giants, Circe, the dead, the Sirens, the strait, the cattle, Calypso, all of it. The entire middle stretch of this epic. Everything you and I have heard of the wanderings, we have heard exactly the way the Phaeacians heard it, from Odysseus's own mouth, at a feast, after dinner. Homer, with a storyteller's own quiet wit, made his hero the narrator of his own legend, and left every listener since to wonder just how much the most famous liar in Greece may have improved along the way. The Phaeacians, spellbound, did not merely believe him, they paid him. Alcinous called for gifts from every noble present, bronze and gold and fine woven cloth, until the stranger, who had crawled ashore naked, possessed more treasure than his own share of Troy's plunder, the plunder that now sat at the bottom of the sea with his lost ships. Then they made good on their reputation as the finest sailors in the world. A ship was launched, the gifts stowed aboard, and Odysseus, after his farewells, in which Nausicaa asked only that he remember her, since she had saved him first, lay down on a blanket on the deck. The enchanted ship ran west through the night faster than any hawk could fly, and sleep took him deep and sweet, the poet says, most like death, the very last sleep of the whole voyage. He did not wake when the ship touched Ithaca. The Phaeacian crew carried the sleeping king ashore, laid him gently on the sand of his own island, stacked his treasure beside an olive tree, and rowed quietly away. After 20 years, 10 of war and 10 of wandering, Odysseus came home unconscious, and missed it entirely. Poseidon exacted one final toll, not from Odysseus himself, but from the men who had carried him. As their ship entered its own home harbour, the god turned it to stone with a single blow of his open hand, a ship-shaped rock left standing forever in sight of the city, a permanent notice regarding the ferrying of his enemies. Alcinous, watching it happen, remembered an old prophecy and instituted a policy change on the spot concerning rides for strangers. The last open door along the whole sea road had just closed for good. On the beach of Ithaca, the sleeping man began to stir. He was about to wake up in his own country and fail entirely to recognize it. Athena had wrapped the coast in mist, partly for his own protection, and partly, one suspects, because she rather enjoyed what came next. He looked around at the harbour, the olive tree, the very hills of his own childhood, and groaned aloud that the Phaeacians had cheated him after all, and dumped him on some new, unfamiliar shore. He counted his treasure to see what they had stolen, and found nothing missing at all. There is something almost perfect in it. The man had imagined this exact homecoming for 20 straight years, and when it finally arrived, he slept through the actual arrival, and then failed to recognize his own destination. A young shepherd appeared through the mist, and Odysseus, instantly and entirely by reflex, lied to him. Asked who he was, he improvised an entire biography on the spot. A Cretan fugitive, a killing over stolen plunder, passage bought on a Phoenician ship, detail after plausible detail. The shepherd listened to the whole performance and then smiled and changed shape. It was Athena. Her delight, as she dropped the disguise, is one of the warmest moments in the entire epic. Anyone who could out-trick you, she said, would have to be a master thief among the gods themselves. You incorrigible schemer, still lying even in your own country. This is exactly why I cannot abandon you. You are just like me. Then she scattered the mist and showed him the harbour and the long, familiar ridge of the mountain, and Odysseus knelt down and kissed the earth of Ithaca at last. What followed was a war council between the goddess and the man, crouched together against the trunk of that olive tree. She told him everything waiting for him in his own palace, the 108 suitors, the pressure closing in on Penelope, the plot already forming against his son, and together they settled on the strategy that would govern everything from this point until the very end. No open arrival. Agamemnon's ghost had given that warning back in Hades, and here, at last, it became doctrine. He would enter his own kingdom as an intelligence operation, identify exactly who had stayed loyal across 20 years, and strike only once everything stood in place. To make that possible, Athena performed her transformation. She withered the skin on his once supple limbs, dimmed his eyes, stripped the brown hair from his head, and dressed him in a filthy tunic, a mangy deerskin, and the staff and pouch of a common beggar. The king of Ithaca had become, in effect, an old vagrant, invisible in the one way that actually matters, beneath any second glance. His first stop, on Athena's own instruction, was not the palace at all. It was a pig farm in the hills, and the man who ran it earns his own permanent place in this story. Eumaeus, the swineherd, himself a slave, had kept his absent king's herds honestly for 20 full years, while the suitors devoured them steadily from the other end, and his greeting to the anonymous old beggar at his gate stands as the moral centre of the entire poem. He beat off his own dogs to protect the stranger, brought him inside, fed him from the very best he had, and explained his own generosity with a line that has outlived empires since. "All strangers and beggars," he said, "come from Zeus, and even a small gift is welcome." The disguised king spent several days inside that hut, quietly testing the man from every angle he could think of, and found nothing in him but loyalty. Eumaeus spoke of his lost master with such open grief and love, refusing even to believe the travellers' tales that occasionally claimed the king still lived, since too many liars had already traded on the queen's fragile hope, that Odysseus, listening from inside his own disguise, found himself hearing his own eulogy delivered by the one audience in the world who had no reason at all to be performing for him. There are far worse ways to learn what your own life has amounted to. Meanwhile, the poem's other thread was making its way home as well. Telemachus had been away on the mainland these past weeks, and his own journey matters enough to tell briefly here. Prodded into motion by Athena at the very start of this whole story, the boy who had grown up entirely fatherless had sailed off to seek any news he could find, and the trip itself had become his education. In sandy Pylos, old King Nestor had received him with overwhelming hospitality and endless war stories. In Sparta, Menelaus and Helen themselves, restored to one another now in an uneasy sort of domestic peace, told him more of his father's exploits, and Menelaus passed along the one genuinely hard piece of intelligence in the entire Greek world, gathered years earlier from a shape-shifting sea god in Egypt, that Odysseus was alive, held somewhere on an island by a nymph. The boy who had left Ithaca, a passive, rather hopeless teenager, was coming home now as something else entirely. A young man who had sat at the tables of kings, been formally recognized as his father's son, and learned, at last, how to speak and how to act. This proved fortunate, because the suitors had laid an ambush for him on his return, a ship of armed men waiting in the strait to murder him quietly on his way home. Warned in time by Athena, he sailed a different course under cover of night, landed instead on a far beach, and, exactly as the goddess had arranged it, walked straight up to the hut of Eumaeus, arriving just as the swineherd and the old beggar sat down together to breakfast. Eumaeus wept over the boy like a father over a son returned from the dead, which tells you plainly enough who had truly raised him. The swineherd was then sent off to the palace with a message for Penelope, and the beggar and the young man were left alone together. Athena appeared, visible only to Odysseus, and touched him, and the disguise fell away all at once, the rags becoming clean clothing again, the years dropping off his frame, and Telemachus, watching the transformation happen before his own eyes, concluded, quite reasonably, that he was facing a god. "No," said Odysseus, and the line lands with the full weight of 20 years of ocean behind it. "No god. I am your father, for whose sake you have grieved and suffered and endured the violence of other men." Telemachus did not believe him at first, which is its own particular kind of heartbreak. And then belief arrived all at once, and the two of them broke down together, weeping, Homer says, more piercingly than eagles robbed of their own young. And they would have wept on until sunset if the work waiting for them had allowed it, because the reunion turned almost immediately into a council of war. Odysseus laid out the arithmetic plainly, 2 of them against more than 100 suitors. Telemachus, to his credit, raised the obvious objection that the odds were simply insane, and his father answered with the only allies who actually mattered here, Athena and Zeus. The plan was set. The beggar's disguise would go back on. Telemachus would return to the palace and reveal nothing at all, not even to his own mother. At the right moment, on a prearranged signal, he would quietly remove the weapons hanging on the walls of the great hall and lock them away in the storeroom, leaving arms only for the 2 of them. And whatever abuse the disguised king suffered inside his own house, the son would have to swallow his own rage and let it happen. So the next morning, Telemachus went home to his anxious mother, and behind him, along the mountain path, came the swineherd and a broken-down old beggar, walking together toward the palace of Odysseus. At the courtyard gate they passed a rubbish heap, and on that heap something stirred. It was a dog, an old, dying dog, abandoned on the dung, too weak to even rise, crawling with vermin. His name was Argos. Odysseus had bred and trained him as a puppy 20 years earlier, and sailed for Troy before he had ever hunted a single day with him. The young men of the house had taken him out in the years since, after wild goats and hares, and then the years had simply gone on passing, and no one had cared for him at all. And now he lay there on the heap by the gate. And as the beggar approached, the old dog knew him. Through the rags, through the wrinkles, through 20 years, through a disguise a goddess had woven that would fool every human being inside that palace, Argos knew his master. He had no strength left to come any closer. He only dropped his ears and wagged his tail. Odysseus saw it and could not react at all. One gesture toward that dog, and the disguise, the plan, the lives of his entire family, all of it stood at risk. He turned his face away from Argos, flicked away a tear where Eumaeus could not see it, and asked, in a stranger's careless voice, whose dog that was lying there, and whether he had been any good in his day. "Fine dog once," said the swineherd. "The fastest thing in these woods, before his master sailed off and died somewhere far away. And now the women here neglect him entirely." And they walked on past, into the courtyard, master and dog, pretending, for the sake of the mission, not to know each other at all. And Argos, Homer tells us, having seen Odysseus again in the 20th year, closed his eyes and died. Of every death in this whole poem, warriors, kings, and entire crews included, it is the dog on the rubbish heap that readers have never quite gotten over. He asked for nothing, waited without ever being asked to, and held on, it seems, for exactly one single thing. 20 years of the whole epic's meaning compressed down into one wag of a dying tail. The beggar wiped his face, gathered his rags, and stepped over his own threshold into a hall full of the men who were eating through his kingdom and courting his wife. Every one of them stood armed with youth, numbers, and confidence. He stood armed with a stick and a lie. It was enough. It was, in fact, considerably more than enough. But they still had a few days left before they found that out. Inside the occupied palace, the great hall Odysseus entered as a beggar was the true heart of his own house, and it is worth walking through it slowly, exactly as he did, because it belongs to a world we can genuinely reconstruct today. Archaeologists have dug palaces of this same age out of the Greek earth, at Mycenae, at Pylos, at Sirens, and their centerpiece was always the very room Homer describes here, the Megaron, a long rectangular hall with a great round hearth burning at its center, 4 columns ringing it to hold up the roof, a vent above for the smoke, and the king's own seat set against the far wall. Feasting benches lined either side, the walls stood plastered and painted, and the floor of Odysseus's own hall, at this particular moment in history, was crowded with 108 uninvited men eating his pigs. Since we have arrived at last at a Bronze Age palace in something close to peacetime, it is worth a moment to look at the people of this world, from the top of it down to the bottom, because the whole poem is really built out of their differences. At the top sat the kings and the landed nobles, men like Odysseus and the suitors' own fathers, whose wealth was measured not in coin, which did not yet exist anywhere in this world, but in land, livestock, bronze, and stored treasure, tripods and cauldrons and fine cloth given and received as gifts. Their days, as Homer paints them, were spent feasting, hunting, competing, meeting in assembly and making war, while their wives ran large productive households and held command of the storerooms themselves. Such men wore a tunic of fine wool or linen, with a great cloak pinned at the shoulder, and a princess dressed in layered, flounced skirts of bright, dyed fabric, gold at her ears and wrists. Below them came the farmers and herdsmen working their own plots, the craftsmen, smiths, potters and shipwrights, and a class the poem treats with particular respect, the travelling professionals, the seer, the healer, the carpenter, the bard, welcome at any door because their skills travelled wherever they did. Below these stood the thetes, free men without land who hired themselves out for wages, whom Achilles' own ghost had named as the very bottom rung of free existence. And below them, the slaves, mostly women taken in raids, grinding the endless daily grain, weaving, carrying water, though a trusted few, like Eumaeus with his pigs, or the old nurse Euryclea, ran their own departments with real authority, and were spoken of almost as family. Everyone, high and low alike, lived on roughly the same trinity of staples, barley and wheat for bread and porridge, wine always cut with water, and olive oil for both lamp and skin, with figs, cheese, onions and legumes alongside. The endless roast meat of Homer's great feasts was in fact a luxury of the wealthy house, and marked an occasion even there. Meat meant sacrifice, and sacrifice meant the gods received the smoke and the savour, while mortals, by a convenient arrangement first negotiated in myth by Prometheus himself, received the actual dinner. Into this world, at the very bottom of it, stepped its rightful owner, dressed as the lowest thing a free man could possibly be, and began systematically begging from the men seated at his own tables. It was reconnaissance wearing the costume of poverty. Moving from man to man with his palm out, he was quietly measuring each suitor in turn, sorting, Homer tells us, the decent from the vicious, though the sorting would ultimately change nothing at all in the end, and the suitors obliged him gladly by identifying themselves along the way. Their ringleader was Antinous, the most arrogant of the whole pack, and where the others simply tossed the old beggar scraps, Antinous picked up a footstool and threw it, striking him at the base of the right shoulder. The hall went quiet at that, even by the suitors' own low standards. Striking a beggar was dangerous business, for exactly the reason one of them nervously spoke aloud. The gods, everyone present knew, walked the earth disguised as strangers and beggars, quietly observing the justice and violence of ordinary men. It is the single moment the suitors brush up against the truth of their own situation, and then they simply go back to their wine. The house tested its master too. A genuine beggar named Eros, the palace's own resident sponger, resented the competition and challenged the newcomer to a fist fight, and the suitors, delighted, turned it into sport, putting up a prize of goat sausages for the winner. Odysseus stripped for the bout, revealing rather more thigh and shoulder than his rags had advertised, struck Eros once, carefully, below the ear, and dragged him out by the leg to prop against the courtyard wall. The suitors laughed themselves helpless and congratulated the old fellow warmly. They had just watched their own executioner warming up, and mistaken it entirely for dinner theatre. Meanwhile, the poem turns at last to the person this whole quiet war of nerves has really been about. Penelope, 20 years into a defence with no relief anywhere in sight, chose this particular evening to descend into the hall, radiant, and announce to the suitors that the time of decision was drawing near, and that proper suitors, by the old custom, ought to be bringing her gifts rather than eating a woman's house bare. The suitors scrambled to send home for robes and gold, and Odysseus, watching quietly from his corner in his rags, rejoiced inwardly at the performance. Whether she somehow sensed something that particular night, or whether 20 years with this woman had simply taught him what her manoeuvring looked like from the outside, the beggar in the corner recognized a fellow professional at work. Their interview came late that night, by the dying fire, once the hall had emptied out, the queen and the stranger, husband and wife, only one of them knowing it. She asked who he was, and he spun a Cretan tale again, but laced this time with real truth, claiming to have once hosted Odysseus himself, long ago, and describing, as proof, the very clothes and the golden brooch her own hands had chosen for him 20 years before. Penelope wept at the description, snow melting on distant mountains in Homer's own image, and the man who had caused those tears sat right beside her, unable, in a hall full of enemies, to offer any comfort at all, keeping his own eyes, the poem says, as hard as horn or iron behind their lids. He fed her hope out in careful, measured doses, swearing that Odysseus was alive and near and coming soon. She could not let herself believe it. Hope, for this particular woman, had become the enemy, the very thing that kept picking her own wound open after 2 full decades of waiting. Then she did him a kindness that very nearly ended everything. She called for the old nurse to wash the honoured stranger's feet, and the nurse was Eurycleia, the very woman who had raised Odysseus from infancy. He realized the danger half a second too late. A long scar ran above his knee, taken as a boy from a boar's tusk while hunting on Parnassus with his own grandfather, and every servant of the old household knew that scar by heart. He twisted toward the shadows, but the old woman's hands found it in the washwater anyway, and she knew it, and knew him, instantly. Her eyes flew to Penelope's face, and her lips parted to cry out. Odysseus's hand closed around her throat. "Mother," he whispered, "you will destroy me." Not a word, or you die along with the rest of them. The old woman, iron beneath all her wrinkles, swore herself to silence, and finished washing the feet of the boy she had once nursed, saying nothing at all, while the queen sat only a few steps away, wrapped in her own private sorrow, noticing none of it, because Athena, the poem tells us plainly, had turned her thoughts elsewhere entirely. Before they parted for the night, Penelope told the stranger 2 things. The first was her own dream. 20 geese in the yard, slaughtered by an eagle. The eagle speaking afterward in her husband's own voice. And the beggar assured her the dream needed no interpreter at all. The second was a decision. She could hold out no longer, she told him. Tomorrow she would turn the suit into a contest, her husband's own old game. She would bring out his great bow and line up 12 axes exactly as he used to, and whichever man could string that bow and shoot an arrow clean through all 12 would have her, and she would leave this house forever. The beggar leaned forward and urged her to hold the contest without any further delay. Odysseus, he promised her, of the many devices, would be standing there before a single one of these men ever managed to string that bow. That night, The king lay sleepless in the entryway of his own palace, listening to the giggling of the disloyal serving women slipping out to the suitors' beds. His heart, Homer says, growled inside him like a dog standing guard over her pups, and he struck his own chest and spoke directly to it. "Endure, heart," he said. "You endured worse than this the day the Cyclops devoured your own comrades." And the heart obeyed and endured, and waited out the night for morning, which was about to become quite a day. The contest of the bow. The day of the contest arrived, dressed as an entirely ordinary day, a feast day of Apollo, as it happened, the archer god himself. A detail no one in that hall seems to have found the least bit ominous, though they were very shortly about to. The suitors trooped in as usual, slaughtered the animals as usual, and settled down to their eating, while the omens quietly stacked up around them, unnoticed. A seer among their own number, Theoclymenus, looked out across the laughing company, and suddenly saw them exactly as they would shortly be, shrouded in night, the walls dripping blood, the porch crowded with ghosts hurrying down toward the dark. He said so out loud, and walked straight out of the building. The suitors only laughed and suggested the man needed an escort, since he apparently could no longer tell day from night. There is a particular quality to the laughter of men whose luck has already run out, and Homer lets us listen to every bit of it that whole morning. Then Penelope went to the storeroom. Homer slows the entire poem down for this moment, and we should slow down with it. She took the bent bronze key with its ivory handle, opened the doors of the innermost chamber where the family's treasures lay, and lifted down from its peg the great bow of Odysseus, still in its shining case. It was a legendary weapon, with a history all its own, given to the young Odysseus by a friend later killed by Heracles, and never once carried to Troy, kept at home across all these years purely in memory of that old friendship. The queen sat down with the case across her knees and wept over the bow for a long while. Then she dried her eyes, walked down into the hall full of her feasting enemies, and announced the terms plainly. The bow of Odysseus. 12 axes set in a line, exactly as he used to set them. Whoever strings the bow most easily and shoots an arrow clean through all 12, I will follow him from this house forever. Telemachus dug the trench himself and planted the 12 axes in a dead straight line, to everyone's surprise, quite possibly including his own, and the contest began. Stringing a bow of this kind was a feat of technique as much as raw strength, requiring the archer to bend the whole stiff spring of the weapon back against its own nature, far enough to slip the loop over the notch, and a heavy war bow like this one simply could not be strung by any untrained man, however broad his shoulders happened to be. The suitors were about to sit a public examination, set by the absent examiner himself, in a skill exactly none of them possessed. Whether Penelope understood this perfectly well is a question the poem leaves quietly glinting on the table, unanswered. The first suitor to try, a genuinely decent man, as it happened, could not budge the string at all. The bow, Homer says, simply wore out his hands as he worked it uselessly back and forth. Antinous, sensing a public relations problem developing, called for grease and a fire, and the suitors warmed and larded the weapon and tried it in relays, and one after another, the leading men of Ithaca strained, sweated, and failed, in full view of the very woman they proposed to carry off. Eventually, even Antinous surrendered to prudence and proposed adjourning the contest to another day, since today, after all, was the feast of Apollo, and who shoots arrows on the archer god's own holiday? It was gracefully done. It was also, though he could not have known it, the last good idea of his entire life. While the nobility failed one by one at the bow, the beggar in the corner had been quietly running the final errand of his long game. He had slipped out to the courtyard to find 2 men he had spent days carefully evaluating, Eumaeus the swineherd and Philoetius the cowherd, both grieving openly for their lost master within his hearing, and put a plain question to them. If Odysseus were suddenly to appear right now, whose side would you take? Both answered without a moment's hesitation. Then look at me, Odysseus said, and showed them the scar. The two herdsmen wept over him, kissing his head and shoulders, until he had to hush them and give his orders. Eumaeus was to put the bow into the beggar's hands, whatever anyone in the hall might shout. Then tell the women to bolt themselves into their quarters and stay there no matter what they heard. Philoetius was to lock and lash shut the courtyard gate. The exits of Odysseus's own great hall were quietly closing, one by one, while its occupants argued cheerfully about archery. Back inside, the beggar finally spoke up. "Just to try my own hands," he said, "and see whether any of the old strength still lives in these rags." The suitors erupted, Antinous threatening him outright with mutilation. But Penelope insisted the stranger be given his chance, since was he not, after all, a guest in this house? Telemachus then did something entirely new. He overrode his own mother, in public, sending her upstairs to her weaving with a crisp announcement that the bow was men's business, and his above all others, since the true authority in this house belonged to him. Penelope, startled, obeyed, climbing the stairs to her room, where Athena quietly poured sleep over her eyes. She would sleep mercifully through everything that followed. Eumaeus, running a gauntlet of jeers and abuse, carried the great bow across the hall and set it into the beggar's hands. The room settled down to watch the old man embarrass himself, and Homer gives us that moment through their own mocking eyes in one of the finest similes he ever built. The beggar turned the bow over and over, this way and that, checking whether worms had eaten into the horn during its long years unused, taking his time, while the suitors joked among themselves that the old fellow must be some sort of bow fancier, or perhaps a dealer. Then, the way a singer skilled with the lyre stretches a new string easily around its peg, without effort, without strain, just so did Odysseus string the great bow in one single motion. He plucked the string once with his right hand to test it, and it sang under his touch like the note of a swallow. The colour drained from every suitor's face at once, and at that precise moment Zeus thundered out of a perfectly clear sky, and the beggar smiled at the omen. He was already holding an arrow. He did not stand, did not pose, did not even set his feet properly beneath him. Sitting right there on his stool, he laid the shaft across the bridge of the bow, drew the string back to his ear, and sent the arrow clean through the axe-head sockets of all 12 axes. First shot, end to end, not grazing a single one. Into the silence that followed, he spoke to his son. "The stranger has not disgraced you," he said. "My strength is unbroken, whatever these gentlemen thought of me. And now it is time to serve these Achaeans their supper, while there is still light left, and after it, some other entertainment, with song and the lyre, the crowning graces of any proper feast. It is, without question, the coldest dinner invitation in Western literature, and only 2 people in that entire room understood it. Telemachus heard the signal at once, hung his sword at his side, took his spear in hand, and moved to stand beside the ragged man on the stool, armed now and glittering. Odysseus stripped off his rags in a single motion and leapt up onto the great stone threshold commanding the whole hall, the bow in one hand and his quiver of arrows spilled out at his feet. "Now," he said, "that game is over. There is another target waiting, one no man has ever hit before." Every door stood locked. The walls, thanks to his son's quiet work in the armoury days earlier, hung entirely bare of weapons, and 108 men looked up from their tables at the archer standing between them and the only way out, and understood, at last, exactly whose house they had spent all these years eating. The first arrow went to Antinous. He was lifting a golden two-handled cup of wine to his own lips at that exact moment, and death, Homer observes dryly, was the very last thing on his mind. For who at a feast, surrounded by so many companions, would ever imagine one man attacking an entire crowd alone? The arrow took him clean through the throat, and the cup fell from his hand, and the suitors sprang up roaring, scanning the bare walls where their shields and spears had always hung, shouting at the beggar that he had just killed the noblest young man in all of Ithaca, by accident, and would die for it. They still believed, even then, that it had been some terrible mishap. Odysseus corrected them plainly. "You dogs," he said, "you never once believed I would come home from Troy. You wasted my house, courted my own wife while I still lived, and feared neither the gods above nor any human vengeance below. Now the cords of destruction have fastened themselves around every one of you." Their spokesman, a smooth-tongued man named Eurymachus, reached for the only two tools left to him. First, negotiation, blaming everything conveniently on the newly dead Antinous, and offering full restitution, 20 oxen apiece, bronze and gold, until the king's heart was properly soothed. Odysseus refused it flatly. "Not for your entire inheritances," he said, "would these two hands stop before every last trespass has been paid for in full." Eurymachus then reached for the sword instead, calling the others to charge with the tables themselves as makeshift shields, and got as far as exactly one step. The battle that followed filled the whole hall, and the poem does not rush a single moment of it. Odysseus shot man after man from the threshold while his arrows lasted. Telemachus ran to the storeroom for armour and spears enough to arm their own side. The loyal swineherd and cowherd fought shoulder to shoulder beside their king. 4 men against a mob. There was one breach in the plan, a treacherous goatherd who found his way to the armoury door and had begun quietly arming a dozen suitors before he was caught in the act, trussed, and hauled up a pillar to wait for a later reckoning. And there was one intervention from above. Athena joined the fight herself, first in disguise, then raising her aegis, a terrible storm shield, down from the rafters, and the suitors stampeded the length of the hall like cattle driven mad by a biting fly, while the 4 hunters followed after them, striking, until the floor of that great hall ran and smoked with blood. Homer, who had already watched men die at Troy across one whole epic, spares nothing here, and permits exactly 2 survivors. The bard Phemius, who had sung for the suitors only under compulsion, was spared because a singer's life is sacred. And the herald Medon, who had once looked after the young Telemachus, was found trembling under an ox hide and hauled out alive. Everyone else, all 106 who remained, ended their lives in the very hall they had spent years feasting in. A priest among them, who clasped the king's own knees and begged for his life, was refused, on the grounds that a man who served that company had surely prayed for the king's own death many times over. When it was finally done, Odysseus stood among the bodies, spattered, Homer says, like a lion come fresh from feeding, and forbade the old nurse her cry of triumph over the slain. "It is unholy," he told her, "to gloat over dead men. It was the gods and their own hard deeds that destroyed them." Then came the grimmest housekeeping in all of ancient literature. The 12 maidservants who had betrayed the household were made to carry out the corpses and scrub the tables and the floor clean, and were afterward, on Telemachus's own order, hanged in the courtyard, while the treacherous goatherd met a harder end still. The poem reports all of it without flinching and without apology. This was Bronze Age justice in a Bronze Age house, and the Odyssey was never a gentle story. It was, from the very first line, a story about the price of things. The hall was fumigated with fire and sulphur, and the loyal women poured out of their quarters at last to embrace their master. Upstairs, old Euryclea climbed to the queen's chamber, laughing with a joy she had been holding back for days. "Wake up, child," she said. "He is here. Odysseus is home, and the suitors are dead." Penelope did not believe her. This is the poem's final movement, and it may be its finest. She came down to the hall and sat across the firelight from the man everyone swore was her own husband, and studied him in silence, recognizing him for one moment, seeing only a stranger in poor clothes the next. Telemachus scolded her outright, insisting no other wife in the world would hold back this way from a husband gone 20 years. She answered only that if this man was truly Odysseus, then the two of them had their own private ways of knowing one another, signs hidden from everyone else alive. Odysseus himself, bathed now and made splendid again by Athena, took his own turn at persuading her, and got nowhere at all. She had spent 20 years as the most courted widow in Greece, holding off 100 liars one by one, and she was not about to fail this final exam simply out of longing. So she set her own trap, as casually as her husband had ever set one of his. "Very well," she told the old nurse. "Make up his bed for him, outside the bridal chamber, the sturdy bed he built himself. Move it out for our guest." And Odysseus detonated. "What man has moved my bed?" he demanded. "That bed cannot be moved. I built it with my own hands, around a living olive tree that grew in the courtyard. I trimmed its trunk myself and made it the bedpost, and raised the whole chamber up around it, and inlaid it with gold, silver, and ivory, and no power on earth short of a god could ever shift it without cutting straight through that tree. That is our sign, woman. Tell me, is the bed still rooted, or has someone cut it loose?" It was the password, and only the true man could ever have spoken it, and only by being provoked past his own famous cunning into plain, honest outrage, which was, of course, exactly her design. Her knees gave way beneath her. She ran to him, threw her arms around his neck, kissed his face, and asked him not to be angry, explaining herself in words that closed 20 years like a wound finally allowed to heal. "Do not be angry that I held back so long," she said. "I was always afraid some man would come and deceive me with clever words. There are so many schemers loose in this world." And Homer reaches, one last time, for his final simile, and gives this whole long homecoming its true image at last. As welcome as land is to swimmers whose ship Poseidon has wrecked beneath them, striking out at last from the grey water toward shore, so welcome was her own husband to her, and she could not let her white arms fall from around his neck. The poet had spent this entire epic wrecking one man at sea, again and again. In this last embrace, he finally makes Penelope the shore. Athena, in a single gesture of pure grace, held back the dawn itself, keeping the night in place a little longer while the two of them talked, trading 20 years for 20 years, her long weaving and her long siege, his whole catalogue of wanderings, and Homer notes simply that he told her everything. And this time, at last, we believe him. A few loose ends remained beyond that quiet room, and the poem ties them off briskly. In the morning, Odysseus walked out to the family farm and found his father Laertes there, digging in his own orchard in patched rags, and the son who had tricked half the Mediterranean could not resist one final test, questioning the old man as a stranger until his father's own grief broke him open. And then the scar came out, and after it, the trees, the very pear, apple and fig trees Laertes had given him as a boy, counted and named one by one, and the old man fainted straight into his son's arms. The grieving families of the dead suitors came armed for revenge, exactly as custom demanded, and battle was briefly joined, for a single casualty, before Athena, on Zeus's own instruction, stopped the whole feud with a shout from the sky and imposed a lasting peace on Ithaca, a peace with amnesty on every side, so that the Odyssey, having opened on a household in chaos, closes at last on an island finally at rest. The poem ends there. Its journey never quite has. For nearly 3,000 years, this story has simply been the story. the template lying quietly underneath half the tales our species still tells itself. Every long way home, every clever underdog, every faithful wait, every wanderer's return borrows something from it, usually without even knowing. Its hero's own name became an ordinary noun in 100 languages. An Odyssey, any long and difficult journey towards something that truly matters. Sailors, soldiers, and immigrants have carried this story with them across every sea since. Philosophers have argued with it for centuries. Poets from Virgil to our own age have quietly rewritten it again and again. And through all of that, the heart of the thing has stayed exactly where Homer first set it down. In a man on a beach, refusing eternity because it was not home. In a woman unravelling her own weaving by lamplight, night after night. In a dog's tail, moving one last time on a rubbish heap. And in a bed built around a living tree, still rooted after everything that tried to move it. They found each other again, the two cleverest people in all of Greece. And the tree held, and the long story was finally over. So now, gently, let it be over for you too. There is no more sea left to cross tonight. Every storm has blown itself out somewhere behind you, and every ship, at last, is home. The hall is quiet now. The fires are only embers, banked low and warm, and no voice is raised anywhere in that great room, only the soft sound of people breathing easily, safely, together. Let your own body sink a little heavier into wherever you are lying. Let your jaw soften. Let your shoulders forget, for tonight, everything they have been carrying. Somewhere far off, if you listen, you might still hear water, slow and even, moving toward a shore it already knows by heart. You do not need to follow it. You do not need to do anything at all. Sleep, too, is a kind of homecoming, the oldest one there is, and yours is closer than you think, close enough now to simply let go and arrive.